Chapter 101. A bumpy voyage and recording. Blank. POV narration underscore, blank. The marine ships moved as soon as Enel gave them a destination. We are going to Jaya. The trading port. Former safe haven for pirates in paradise, first half of Grand Line. The rear admirals seemed quite confused with that choice, but they had the supplies to make that journey, with more to spare. We're going to be cutting through the calm belt, so the journey should only take around 3 weeks. One of the rear admirals said as he traced their journey on the large map they had on the table. We don't have an eternal pose for that island though. The other rear admiral said as he looked at the poses they had, which were mostly for marine bases within the Grand Line and larger cities. That's fine, I have this one. Enel placed an eternal pose on the table, the name that had been written on it was scratched out, but the rear admirals decided to just trust Enel on that one. The ships quickly rose their sails, immediately sporting Jolly Rogers. The rear admirals were masquerading as pirates that had stolen 2 marine ships, likely an attempt to do their mission covertly. The Marines also changed into attire fitting the operation, most of them wearing casual clothing. Enel was a bit confused by that, as they had dressed as Marines when entering the village. One of the rear admirals did end up informing him that they only dressed as Marines because they wanted to calm the residents of the village, and had figured that appearing as pirates wouldn't have been a great idea. Added nobleman at. Both rear admirals were now sporting black capes instead of their usual coats, and the ships cut through the high seas with impressive speed. The wind seemed to be with them, as their escape from the islands pertaining to the Goa kingdom was smooth and without any form of interception from government agents. Enel spent some time speaking to the residents of Fuchsia village. Even after a week had passed, many were still mourning the lives lost or shaken by the fact that they now had to uproot their entire lives. Enel could somewhat sympathize with them. The feeling of guilt he had towards them lessened a lot when Whoop Slap, the bandaged-up mayor, ended up thanking him. I guess not all pirates are scum. Enel didn't really know what to say to that. He remembered Whoop Slap being on good terms with Shanks, but he decided not to press the issue too much. Enel didn't get to speak much with the other residents of Fuchsia village. Momonga had somehow already woken up, despite his injuries. The doctors were quite shocked, but Enel wasn't that surprised. He's a full-fledged vice admiral after all. Vice admirals and rear admirals made up a large section of the Navy's fighting power, and many figures among them were strong enough to take on the majority of pirates in the New World. Momonga was rather happy to speak more to his fellow Marines. The rear admirals seemed quite concerned with his missing arm, but Momonga himself was able to take it in stride. I only lost my arm because I was weak. This only means that I must grow stronger from now on. Those were the words that Momonga had given them. Enel could understand that, but he still felt that Momonga was the type to keep silent about his insecurities anyway. And Enel was right to think that. One time, during the night, he managed to speak to him in private for a bit. Well, drink with him was more accurate. Momonga was drinking some sake, looking at his bandaged armless shoulder. Enel could tell that his gaze was complicated. He didn't speak much, he merely sat on the railing of the ship and drank a bit with him. Say a lie enough times, and even you will eventually start to believe it. That was what Momonga was doing. It was how some people chose to deal with loss. And Enel decided not to do much about it. He knew Momonga. He had spoken to him before and while in Marineford. But they weren't exactly friends. Acquaintances were a more apt description of their relationship. Enel drank with him but didn't try to comfort him in any way. Eventually, Enel managed to steal a newspaper off of a colony of newspaper carrying seagulls with hats. The news was about what he and the rear admirals had expected. Demons of Fuchsia village tortured and killed a helpless world noble. All of the residents were in fact branded as demons and were to be hunted by bounty hunters and Marines. They each received a hereditary bounty of 30 million berry. Even the children. Enel whistled a bit when seeing their bounties. The world government sure has a lot of money to spare. The fact that no bounties were different from one another meant that the world government didn't actually have eyes on the situation. Well, none that Enel hadn't killed anyway. After all, Whoop Slap was the one to actually kill the world noble. His bounty would have likely been significantly higher if that was known. That was a good thing, as it meant that the involvement of the Marines would aslo be kept a secret. At least the involvement of some Marines. Momonga didn't get that great of treatment in the press. The noble killer Momonga, a bloodthirsty former Marine that turned against the innocent world noble he was supposed to protect and help the demons of Fuchsia village torture him. He was also credited with killing all of the Marines inside the nearby fake Marine base. Momonga received a bounty of 400 million berry. Unlike the villagers though, he only wanted alive. Most likely thanks to Akainu pulling some strings and preparing for some worst-case scenarios. The villagers were petrified when learning of their new status, not one of them could understand what they had done to deserve such a thing. Whoop slap did give them some perspective. None of us did anything. But our existence happened to annoy someone important, so they simply decided to kill us. It wasn't a comforting thought, and Enel could see that many were scared when hearing that. So he decided to intervene at that point. It can't be helped. From now on, you are all under my protection, so you can rest easy. Enel said as he crossed his arms. The villagers looked up at him with confusion. Many of them knew about him, the Emperor of the Sea, the Sky King, the one that had betrayed the Marines. He certainly had the strength to protect them. But why did he? That question Enel didn't bother to answer, as no one ever asked it anyway. But it would answer itself when they eventually reached their destination. Enel's bounty remained unchanged in that incident, likely because the world government didn't want to admit that he was involved in the matter. It was either that, or they blew their budget on the bounties of the villagers. Either way, Enel didn't care. The world government had made their move, they dug their hole. Now it was up to Enel to push them into it. Single quote. I guess it's time to contact Morgan. He would do that after transporting the villagers to his home base though. After reaching Jaya, he'd be able to carry them in turns to the Sky Island. And the journey went smoothly. At least until they reached the calm belt. The storms got stronger, but they didn't last long, as Enel just blew them off with ease. No natural lightning seemed to even dare to strike their ships. But the Sea Kings were different. Usually, the marine ships would be able to travel freely through the Sea King-infested calm belt, but for some reason, they were a lot more violent than before. Enel threw around lighting pillars all across the seas, killing anything that attacked them in a gruesome fashion. But the Sea Kings seemed almost mindless in the way they were attacking. Momonga also seemed to be unable to understand what was happening. Usually, Sea Kings are extremely intelligent. But they seemed to have all gone mad. Momonga also cut the head of one Sea King that got too close to the ship. He had fought Sea Kings before, so he could recognize the fact that they were behaving strangely. Enel killed more and more Sea Kings as they cut their way through the calm belt. The sea around them was dyed red. Many of the civilians on the ship were scared by the situation, but they were also scared by Enel's power. At the very least, that power was being used to protect them, so it wasn't exactly a bad thing. Eventually, Enel caught something in the corner of his comprehension. He looked to the side, and far into the distance, he could see a black dot. Upon further inspection, it was actually a rowboat, and a single person was sitting inside of it. Then he heard it within his observation hockey. The tortured screams of a woman. It didn't exactly take a genius to realize that the sounds were coming from the ship. His electromagnetic waves bent around the entire boat as Enel realized that the sound was coming from a speaker. He narrowed his eyes as he turned to Momonga and said, "Protect the ship while I do something." Enel then proceeded to turn into a bolt of lightning, appearing again above the small rowboat. This time, he could see and feel a piece of strange equipment on that ship. It seemed to be a speaker, looping the same sounds of a tortured woman over and over again. Sea Kings seemed to not be attacking that rowboat, but Enel could feel them becoming angrier when they were close to it. Enel didn't waste any time, appearing in front of the person on the rowboat and looking at him with an empty gaze. Quote. A recording of a former Poseidon being tortured. I guess you seem like the type of people to keep that around. The agent seemed to be startled by Enel's appearance. It was clear that he was nothing more than small fry. He was disposable, sent there with an easy-to-replicate piece of equipment. He was likely not expected to return alive from his mission anyway. So they were tracking our location after all. I just hope the pirate ship cover strategy worked out. Enel turned the cassette player-looking contraption with ease, as his other hand extended and crushed the man's neck almost instantly. The Mon didn't have the time to react. Then something unexpected happened. The man's body seemed to bloat out instantly, exploding as Enel simply flashed away. He had grabbed the equipment as he took to the skies. Seems pretty nifty. Though a bit twisted, was the thought he had as the contraption also glowed a bit in orange light. Enel simply rolled his eyes, dropping it as it was exploding and reappearing above the two ships he was escorting. Of course, they'd have a dead man switch. Chapter 102. Reasons, Confidence and Sky. Blank. Pav narration underscore, blank. Enel was a bit annoyed at losing the recording, but there wasn't much he could have done in that situation. He had somewhat expected that to happen, but he had hoped things would work out better. He could also tell that the explosions weren't meant to actually injure him in any way. At least they weren't meant to injure someone at his level. They were just meant to destroy the evidence of the government's involvement, as well as the strange weapon they used to turn all of the Sea Kings mad. Enel was quite annoyed when he found out that they were being tracked, but it wasn't like they had been away from civilization during that entire journey to the Calm Belt. They had passed by a few islands, and even if they didn't make any stops, their location was likely reported and the Shipei Pole was able to trace them and determine that they were heading for the first part of the Grand Line through the Calm Belt. What Enel had trouble understanding wasn't exactly that though. Why exactly did they use such a method? They must have been aware that Enel was also on the ships, especially after they saw the corpses at Fuchsia Village. So why exactly did they try to attack using only Sea Kings? They had also revealed the fact that they had other ancient weapons in possession, or at the very least had recordings of a former Poseidon's voice. Enel doubted that Shirahoshi had been caught, but if the world government had those types of recordings then they must have already discovered that the powers of Poseidon only manifested in merfolk. Is that why fishman slaves are sought after among world nobles? It wouldn't surprise me. It was likely that the world government didn't know the power could only manifest in the royal family that ruled over Fishman Island, so they were trying to find the next Poseidon among the regular population for now. Still, to think that mere recordings would hold such power. I guess I still don't know enough about Poseidon yet. Enel couldn't quite put his finger on why exactly the world government had made the decision to reveal one of their cards so brazenly, especially now that they had somewhat acknowledged him as an enemy. Had they just become completely arrogant and conceited? That was a possibility, certainly would have explained some of its moves as of late. They had acted against his expectations and imprisoned Garp, who was admittedly a thorn in their side, but they should have thought more about the consequences of such actions. Because of that, they had completely alienated most of the leading figures of the Marines, which now most likely despised the world government more than they respected it. They also targeted Garp's hometown and demonized all of them just as they had done in the past to the people of Ohara. This was bound to raise many questions, and a lot of people were going to come to their own conclusions on that matter. A lot of the other Marines were also bound to ask questions. As Fuchsia Village was the hometown of the Marine hero. Especially since the world government had tried to portray the world noble as faultless, and anyone that paid any attention to rumors knew how vile celestial dragons were. Overall, incompetence could have been used to explain all of their recent mishaps. But Enel somehow found it hard to believe that incompetence was truly the reason for his enemy's choices. Especially not when said enemy had already been ruling the world for the past few centuries. So a second way to explain their actions came into mind. Are they just really confident? So confident in their own powers that they didn't believe the Marines were an important force to them. So confident that they were simply able to do whatever they wanted. When thinking of them as confident, another explanation for them taking out the recording of Poseidon came to mind. Maybe they are showing off. Trying to make me more cautious. Are they afraid I would just recklessly rush the Holy Land and kill any celestial noble I get my hands on? Or are they baiting me? Are they pretending to reveal all of their cards, and hoping I'd be enraged and impatient enough to simply attack them? Maybe they have something prepared at the Holy Land to greet me, at Nobleman at. Enel simply had no way to know for sure at that point. He needed more information, but most importantly, he couldn't act rashly. For now, let's try to solve my spiritual problems. I have to look more into souls. Dragon should have gathered most of the information they found by now. If he hasn't, then I'll tighten the deadline. I need answers and fast. Enel also decided silently that he'd visit the Fishman Islands, just to make sure nothing bad had happened to Shirahoshi. But for now, Enel decided not to think about the world government anymore. He wouldn't get any answers if he simply stood around and waited. For now, he could sense the Sea Kings going back to the depths as his electromagnetic waves scanned the seawater. Really, this is more like a futuristic radar than anything. Observation hockey usually only allowed one to feel the outline of someone's aura. So being able to perfectly sense the exact shape of everything even underwater when those things weren't in sight was quite liberating. The sea was still dyed red in Sea King blood, and it would likely take a few weeks for it to recover its usual blue color. Enel landed on the ships, where he was greeted by a blood-covered Momna. The two rear admirals were also just as drenched in blood. The three of them had killed quite a few Sea Kings themselves, but they surely would have been killed without Enel's interference. In the end, the two ships continued their journey, with Enel sitting mostly on the deck of the warship, overlooking the seas in the distance. He remained vigilant, as he now knew that the world government likely knew what route they were taking. But the rest of the journey was thankfully uneventful. They reached Jaya swiftly, with a few days to spare. On Enel's orders though, no one disembarked. Instead, everyone was told to simply hold on tightly to something within the ship. Even Momonga and the other two rear admirals listened to Enel's words, as they didn't test what would have happened if they refused to listen. Brace for a rough takeoff. Enel shouted as the water underneath the ships became energized. In fact, all of the water within 1 kilometer of the ships became the same. And the water quickly started shifting. Slowly, 5 pillars seemed to rise from the water. Momonga looked at Enel with wide eyes when seeing that, and so did Whoop Slap, who looked at the pillars with a shocked gaze. Quote. The sea is under his control. From the distance, the pillars looked like the fingers of a water giant, ascending from the depths while grasping the ships within its palm. And the ships started to gain altitude, the water level starting to rise quickly underneath them, as they stood in the palm of that giant hand. Many panicked when feeling the ships they were on shifting, but they had been told to hold on in advance, so it wasn't like they were taken by surprise. But that also didn't mean they weren't going to scream as they kept gaining altitude. It got a lot worse when they could see birds actually flying underneath them. Yes, the giant hand extended to the skies, piercing the clouds with ease and even going further above them. Eventually, a path opened up for the ships, as the palm of the giant fell apart, freeing the ships as they flowed with the water, diving directly into the sea of clouds. Enel smiled a bit, as he also started controlling the sea of clouds to hold them up as the ships stabilized in water and stopped swaying. Enel simply looked at everybody with a smile as he hovered in between the two ships. Onwards. To the Sky Islands. Enel's voice proclaimed loudly as the Marines quickly recovered and quickly raised their sails. The ships sailed forwards for a few more hours, passing through the Heaven's Gate, where the receptionist didn't dare to ask them for an entry fee, as she froze completely when she saw Enel. The villagers found that reaction to be a bit odd, but they decided not to think about it too much. Enel was a pirate at the end of the day, he was bound to have people that feared him. So, their journey continued, all until they could finally see it. A large city, perched up on the clouds. Buildings floating in the air, scooters and wagons flying around as people seemed to be in a celebratory mood. The residents of Fuchsia Village, and even the Marines, looked at the scene with wonder. It was the first time in their lives that they had witnessed such a scene. Unfortunately, their approach seemed to somewhat kill the atmosphere in the large city. It seemed like the Sky residents weren't all that welcoming to visitors. Wiper came out of the crowds and to the shore of the island to greet the incoming ships, which managed to calm down the residents greatly. After all, Wiper was someone everyone on Skypa trusted at that point, Gonfal's right-hand man and a person powerful enough to protect them. Those feelings changed again when Enel appeared in front of Wiper, with the ships still in the distance. Wiper. Enel. The two of them shook hands, testing each other's grip strengths with strained smiles on their faces. Enel seemed to win that competition though, with Wiper giving up and taking back his arm with a scowl. Why aren't you wearing a shirt? Wiper asked as he crossed his arms. Don't judge my wardrobe. Didn't have the time to get dressed before going out initially. And I was too lazy to return and get dressed properly afterwards. Whatever. Why are you bringing 2 ships full of people here? Yeah, about that. It might be better if I explain things to everyone at once. Can you call everyone to Gonfal's office? Wiper simply nodded and flew away, stepping on air as he used Geppo to make his way to Gonfal's office. He was most likely showing off that he had learnt one of the 6 powers already. This made Enel smile a bit, as he flashed back to the ships. He told the people there to stop near the shore for now, while he was to deal with their new living arrangements. Then he headed for Gonfal's office after a few minutes, where he could feel that everyone had already gathered. God. Garp isn't going to like this one bit. Chapter 103. Rage, Humiliation and Gratitude. Blank. Pav narration _ blank. Enel reached the meeting room instantly, as he didn't bother to walk among the Sky people for now. The room did have a lot more people than usual. Any meeting usually only had him and Gonfal in the past, with Wiper sometimes joining in if he felt like it. Now, both Garp and Francisco were present, as well as a few elders of Skypa, Gonfal himself and Wiper. It had already been over 2 months since Enel had left, so everyone was quite curious as to why he'd be returning with 2 large ships, presumably filled with people. Francisco was now looking a lot healthier. A good diet of a lot of meat seemed to heal his atrophied muscles, and now his physique was quite similar to that of Garp, at least in looks. Unfortunately, his severed tendons and melted eyes had no chance of recovering. At least not naturally in any way. He was far from his prime, but his life expectancy did shoot up a year or 2. Garp was looking around the same as Enel had left him, though he now had a worried look in his eyes. Enel greeted everyone with a small smile and a wave of his gauntleted hand. Hello everyone. Thank you all for dropping by on such short notice. Enel said, his smile dying down as he looked over at Garp with a serious look. He could easily notice the worry in the old man's eyes, so he decided to simply rip the band-aid off quickly. This is a rather grave issue. The world government decided to act sooner than expected against Fuchsia Village, which is Garp's hometown, by the way. Enel said as he heard the table on Garp's end crack. Garp's iron grip clutched at the table, as his expression became hard to read. I understand your anger. Thankfully, things ended up in our favor. Garp's grip on the poor wooden table somewhat lessened when he heard Enel's words. He looked at Enel with a complicated gaze, as he forced himself to calm down and continued to listen to the Sky King's words. Enel then proceeded to tell everyone of the world government moving a world noble into Fuchsia Village. Plenty of people looked a bit confused when hearing about world nobles, only Garp and Francisco seemed to narrow their eyes when hearing that title. When gauging their reactions, Enel decided to give everyone a brief description of world nobles. Well, they are like the OL like I was here, back in the day. Tyrannical leaders basically. Leaders of the entire world. They have enough arrogance and stupidity to annoy just about anything with a pulse. Francisco chuckled a bit when hearing that description. It seemed his opinion on the world nobles was also not that great. Also, he and Garp already knew about Enel's past on the Sky Islands. They didn't know the entire story, fabricated or not, but they knew that he had turned over a new leaf and even the people he had persecuted were now his friends, so they didn't hold it against him. Enel couldn't help but scowl internally at his own words, as he remembered how the celestial dragons were portrayed in the show. They were actually really similar to the old Enel, scarily so. Although there was one difference. They also don't really have any power individually, just the sense of superiority over others. Their actual influence comes from the world government, which seems to hold them all on a pedestal and revere them as, well, gods I guess. Enel shrugged as he explained a bit more about the celestial dragons. They were all just weaklings, maybe with a few exceptions who learned how to fight for their own reasons, but the majority weren't worth mentioning, let alone praising or worshipping. He also mentioned a few things about their propensity to treat every other intelligent race as beneath them and to engage in slavery. Wiper seemed to scoff when hearing about that. So people just put up with them out of fear of the world government. Pathetic. He had been part of the resistance group that fought against the old Enel. They didn't submit to Enel in any way, even when he had the capability to nuke all of them into non-existence instantly. He found the thought of the people below the clouds just becoming subservient to weaklings to be disappointing. Good news is, the Marines had apparently prepared for something like that to happen. Sengoku and Akainu specifically asked Vice Admiral Momonga to look after Fuchsia Village, as he was tasked with protecting the world noble that got sent there. Garp smiled a bit when hearing that, probably remembering his old friends in the Marines and/or thanking them internally. With the two ships on our shores, I'm assuming things didn't quite go as swimmingly as planned, right? Francisco said as he tilted his head a bit. Yeah, long story short, the celestial dragon did what he knew best and that got him killed. Momonga fought the CP agents stationed there to protect the village. Garp looked at Enel with wide eyes at that point. A celestial dragon simply dying like that was unheard of, which was why Garp now knew just how bad the situation was. I got called by Akainu, as he intercepted a signal and stopped a buster call from happening. The rest is history, and the survivors are going to be moving on our beautiful Sky Island. Enel clapped his hands. Gonfall simply gave him a frustrated look. More housing issues to deal with. But he didn't say anything, especially not when seeing just how angry Garp seemed to be when hearing that last part. Wait, the survivors. How many casualties were there? Garp got up. His fists crushed the table in front of him completely, as Francisco, who was closest to him, slid his chair backwards to dodge the incoming wood chips. Quote. Surprisingly low. I didn't get there in time to save everyone, unfortunately. At Nobleban at. The mountain bandits from Dayton's family actually had the most casualties, with 16 of them dying. Only around 9 villagers actually died, although a lot of them were injured, some even critically. Garp somewhat calmed down when hearing that, but he was still trembling in anger, so he wasn't too far off from wanting to storm the Holy Land and take the world government down a peg. Quote. I see. Thank you, Enel, for saving the. Garp started with a deep sigh. He was about to give Enel his heartfelt thanks for yet another situation. He didn't like doing that at all, Enel had already helped him numerous times, and now he was even protecting his hometown's residents. For the old marine hero that only liked relying on his fists, this type of thing was actually humiliating. Especially since the villagers were only attacked because of him. Enel already knew Garp enough to realize that he'd be bothered by such a thing, so he interrupted the old man mid-sentence. Don't. I didn't do much. Momonga and Daiden as well as Akainu and Sengoku, are the ones you ought to be thanking right now. Were it not for them, there wouldn't have been anything for me to save. Enel shook his head as he gave the credit for the entire situation on the 4 people he had mentioned. In truth, he wasn't wrong. Without Akainu's call, he would have still been informed about it thanks to Dragon's information. But without Momonga, who was sent by Sengoku and Garp, everyone, besides maybe a few people to be kept as hostages, would have been killed. Without Daiden, most of the villagers would have been killed regardless of Momonga's struggles, as she and her family had bought them those last few minutes before Enel arrived. And, finally, without the rear admirals and their ships, they wouldn't have been able to escape quite as smoothly. And many of the injured would have died. The rear admirals had both doctors and supplies to deal with anything, so they were basically a godsend for that village. And all of that was thanks to Akainu and Sengoku pulling strings. Enel hadn't put his life on the line, he hadn't risked anything really. It was a task that actually took zero effort for him. So, at the end of the day, Enel didn't really feel like he had done enough to receive Garp's thanks. I see. Well, I'll make sure to speak to them and give them my thanks. Garp smiled a bit, looking a bit to the side before his head finally snapped back at Enel. Why wait? Not like they can't be contacted. Also, we should probably call the ships over to shore. Gonfal said as he started thinking more about their living arrangements. Hey, Daiden and Momonga are already on the ships, so you'll thank them later. Akainu and Sengoku are likely preoccupied at the Holy Land though. Enel said with a lazy smile. The meeting continued for a bit, as they all decided to let the villagers live on Upper Yard in the future, where their homes would be built. Garp already ordered his students to start construction at that very moment. He said it would just make for great training, and he was totally not using them as cheap labor. Eventually, as the meeting was dying down, Francisco turned his head to Enel and rubbed his nose. Captain Enel, where's that lass, Bonnie? He asked with a confused tone. Shit. Chapter 104. Island Survival and Forgotten Prisoner. Blank. Pav narration _ blank. 1 month or so, he said. Sure. Why not? Must be good training. To say that Bonnie was pissed would have been a rather large understatement. In the first place, she hadn't agreed to be thrown into the wilderness. Enel had somewhat forced that onto her. She could somewhat feel the benefits of that training after 2 months had passed. But there was another issue for her. I am so hungry. She had already cleared her part of the island of any wildlife, even ferocious beasts now ran away from her, as she had already defeated everything on that island and eaten plenty of its residents. At first, some predators were actually strong enough to harm her, but her devil fruit abilities actually helped her a lot. All she needed was a simple touch, and her enemy was out of commission. After the wild animals figured out that she was dangerous, they seemed to start avoiding her scent completely. Which made hunting somewhat harder. As if running out of meat wasn't bad enough, she also had to deal with the fact that most of her food wasn't seasoned, so it tasted rather bland unless the animal she found was a bit special. Water was thankfully not an issue. She had found a river quite quickly after being dropped on the island. She was even lucky enough to find a cave nearby. In the 2 months she fought for her survival, she also gained some mastery over Geppo and Rankyaku, which were the ones Enel had told her to focus on for now. She was also close to being able to perform Kami-e, but that would take her quite a bit more time to gain proficiency in. She had made staggering progress, and even had some inkling at controlling her willpower, though she was far from actually materializing it as armament hockey or observation hockey. Other than that, all of her senses, as well as her instincts, were sharpened and shaped by that wild environment. At that point, after so much training and constant struggle, only one thing was missing: Adat Nobleban at. Where the fuck is he? Bonnie had been waiting on Enel to arrive and take her away from that island for a whole month. At first, she thought that he was just extending her training to see more results. But now that about twice the time frame he had given her had passed, she was starting to think that Enel had just forgotten about her. And, in all fairness, she managed to hit the nail right on the head. He was going to go take her away at some point. She did cross his mind a few times while he was with the Revolutionary Army. But the few weeks he spent transporting the villagers had basically made him forget about her completely. In all fairness, he did have more important things to worry about. But that didn't mean Bonnie also knew that, nor did it mean that she had to like the situation. At some point, she started building a raft, thinking that maybe she'd get lucky and manage to sail to another island. She was too afraid to do it in the end, as her fear of the sea manifested when seeing how shitty her raft was. It was barely being held together with ropes made from vines. There's no way this thing's surviving anything on the Grand Line. So Bonnie ended up remaining on the island. Part of her daily routine consisted of constantly cursing Enel, while also hoping he'd come for her. In the end, after well over 2 months of arriving there, the skies finally stirred. Lightning bellowed and thunder roared, the skies shining as the beasts on the island seemed to become more and more frightened by the second. Bonnie walked out of her cave with a scowl on her face. There hasn't been a storm on this island the entire time I've been here. She looked up at the sky with expectation in her gaze, as a large golden ship seemed to appear from it. It seemed a bit different from what she remembered. Its size had definitely increased, it seemed to part the clouds with its pointed front. Bonnie smiled as she saw it, swearing through her teeth as the ship's design became clearer as it got closer to her. It was a Viking longship, golden paddles extended on both sides, constantly rowing, powered by some odd contraption, at least that was what Bonnie guessed. Behind the ship, 2 large spinning turbines could be seen, both spinning so fast that Bonnie could basically only see the outline of 2 circles behind the ship. A golden dragon as its figurehead, its large mouth seemed to be constantly opened, exposing its sharp teeth to the world. From each side of the ship and from the figurehead's mouth, black storm clouds extended to the skies as Enel descended. Lightning fell near Bonnie's cave, artificially creating a clearing as trees fell on all sides. Bonnie covered her eyes a bit, as her vision got filled with dust. When she opened her eyes again, the ship had already landed, standing straight on 8 golden legs. And a side opened up, extending a golden stairway to the ground. Enel came down from the ship with a smile on his face, trying his best to hide his guilt at having left her deserted on an island and forgetting about her. Bonnie, so great to see you. Enel's words quickly got cut off, as a flying slash passed through his mouth and cut his ship in half. You piece of shit. Bonnie shouted as she sent a few more flying slashes towards him, cutting his ship up a bit more as he just stood there and smiled. The corners of his lips trembled as he stood there, letting all of the flying slashes pass through him and waiting for Bonnie to cool off. Every few hits she would curse at him a bit more, to which he didn't react all that much, although the curses were definitely more effective in hurting him personally. She didn't even appreciate the hard work I put in my new ship design. Enel cried internally as he felt it crumbling in pieces behind him. After a while, Enel decided to stop her. All right, that's enough. He clapped his hands, creating a shockwave large enough to make Bonnie stumble a bit and lose her footing, causing her to fall on her ass. You're such a piece of shit, you know. Bonnie said as she rubbed her behind while getting up. Hey, it seems your training went swimmingly. Enel said, as he raised his palms towards her and shrugged. Swimmingly my ass. There are no spices to be found here. Bonnie said as she crossed her arms and looked to the side. Hey, can't argue with the results, right? Enel waved one of his earlobes at her dismissively. Of course, there are results. I had absolutely nothing else to do here besides train. Quote. That's the whole point of this training method though. Well, I'm glad you got in the right mindset for it. Rage is a great motivator for self-improvement. That back and forth continued a while before Bonnie finally calmed down and just sighed. So, that's it. We're going back to the Sky Islands now? She asked while looking at the bits and pieces of the ship reassembling themselves behind Enel, as he tapped a random piece of the ship with his staff. Yep, I'll take you there and then leave again. I was pretty busy these last few weeks, so I couldn't exactly pick you up. Garp will handle your training from now on. I think you're pretty much ready for that. Enel said as he scratched his cheek a bit. Bonnie just rolled her eyes, not protesting at all. Not like I can get closer to him during training. All he does is teach me stuff, and he takes his role really seriously. In the end, she decided that learning with Garp would be about the same. She was going to get beaten up anyway, so it was of no difference to her. The ship took off instantly, as it started floating instantly, taking off into the storm as Enel sat on a golden throne, and Bonnie randomly sat down near the throne. The two of them spoke quite a bit as Enel sailed his new flying vessel back to Skypa. Enel took his time to bring her up to speed on the most recent news, including his partnership with the Revolutionary Army, and whatever movements the world government was making. Bonnie seemed to be rather surprised at some of the news. The fact that Enel was working hand in hand with yet another powerful organization didn't really shock her at that point though. The two of them reached Skypa rather quickly, and Bonnie instantly said goodbye and ran to the nearest restaurant. He also stopped on Sky Island for a bit, compressing his ship back into a pair of gauntlets. He compressed more gold to create his newer ship model, so now his gauntlets looked a bit bulkier than usual. They also had several holes in their design, where thunder cloud dials were stored. Enel was now able to create more storm clouds even with his gauntlets. He also integrated a few dials in his staff, so as to have enough of them to form a ship. The problem was that he couldn't create anywhere near as many storm clouds from his gauntlets. But it was still a huge improvement over trying to gather regular storm clouds all the time. Obviously, the new gauntlets were a few tons heavier, but slugging around tons of gold had already become normal for Enel though, so he felt no difference. After looking over the construction of the new Fuchsia village, Enel decided to depart once more. At least he did so before he finally remembered something. Single quote. Weren't there some intruders here a while back? Enel then proceeded to flash over to the jail cell, where he could clearly feel one person being held up by sea stone chains. The guards at the door were shocked to see him, but no one actually stopped him. They were likely told that Enel would show up eventually. By now, most of the intruders were likely being used for labor. So only the leader, who was a devil fruit user, was actually still being incarcerated. Enel raised an eyebrow as he saw the captive. He instantly recognized him as well. Quote. Bellamy. Chapter 105. The Hyena. Blank. Pav Enel underscore, blank. I honestly completely forgot about this person's existence. It also doesn't help that I don't really know him that well. I couldn't recognize his aura at all, figured he was just a random prisoner. He felt somewhat familiar, but I never cared enough to actually try and find out who he was. Hell, I didn't even care about the prisoners for a while, had bigger concerns. I guess there were some mentions of him reaching the Sky Island somehow, and bringing some gold to Doflamingo to be accepted back into his crew after his loss to Luffy and Jaya. Are you telling me he's just been here this whole time? Bellamy the Hyena. My voice rang out, echoing off the walls of his empty cell as I could see the blonde man in front of me shift awake. He seems to be wearing a leather jacket and tattered jeans. He doesn't seem to be in that bad of a state. I guess the Sky people don't treat their prisoners that badly. At least not anymore. It's you. Bellamy's eyes seemed to widen in fear when he finally saw me. Even though I look quite a bit different, he still seems to recognize me. I'll say that's thanks to my earlobes, my greatest and most identifiable feature. No need to be scared. I don't mean you any harm. At least not anymore. I raised my palms in a defensive motion, to show that I am of no threat to him. It didn't really work that well going by his reaction, but it still did something, as he managed to calm himself down after a few deep breaths. He's not that stupid, I guess. If we wanted him dead, he wouldn't have been held here for so long. I've been held here for a few months now. What exactly do you want from me? Bellamy seems to have gained some courage. Maybe I was too quick to judge him as not that stupid. I can somewhat guess his thought process though. He figured that he has some type of leverage since he's not been touched. I don't really know what he thinks he has, but it's enough to give him confidence, even when he's actually the one behind bars and bound in sea stone chains. Well, I'll be blunt with you. What method did you use to reach the Sky Islands? So it was that, huh? Bellamy's smile seemed to shine a bit when hearing my words. I'm guessing he's going to try to keep the path he took to himself. Hey, this place is well guarded, but as soon as Captain Doflamingo learns about this, he will easily be able to rescue me. Quote. Yeah, about that. Blank. Pav narration, blank. I did kill Doflamingo and took down his entire group. Enel said as he twirled one of his earlobes around his finger. Bellamy's eyes widened once again, shock and disbelief were clear on his face. Enel simply sighed as he realized that Bellamy had likely been held captive ever since Enel's little massacre on Jaya Island. Wait, how exactly did he escape in the first place? Enel racked his mind a bit. He didn't remember Bellamy fleeing the scene at Jaya. He was captured alongside the other pirates. I didn't hear any reports of prisoner ships being attacked. Did Doflamingo pull some strings? Enel in the end decided not to bother himself with that anymore. Bellamy was a non-issue to him anyway. Although, Enel did remember him as being quite talented. If I remember correctly, he was also able to learn armament and observation in just 2 years. Just like Luffy. But unlike Luffy, I doubt he had someone like Rayleigh nearby to teach him. That thought made Enel look at Bellamy in a bit of a different light. Even if he was older than Luffy, he had still displayed quite a bit of talent. Luffy had managed to take him out in one punch while injured back in Jaya, and he'd grow to learn 2 types of hockey and become strong enough to sail in the new world. That was all in 2 years, and with no masters to teach him anything. Maybe he'd be worthwhile to recruit. I get your shock, especially if you were loyal to him. But he wasn't the type to appreciate your loyalty, I assure you. Enel's words seemed to bother Bellamy quite a bit, as the small-time pirate struggled against his chains for a bit. What do you know? Bellamy growled in between his clenched teeth. As I said, I was the one to take him down. A lot has happened since you were incarcerated. Maybe it's time someone brought you up to speed. Enel then proceeded to do just that, telling Bellamy everything related to Doflamingo's crew. Bellamy's shocked expression seemed to extend for quite a while, and he looked down in a guilty manner when learning of the scope of Doflamingo's crimes. He liked to think of Doflamingo as a respectable person to follow. But it was hard to do that when hearing so much about the deplorable shit he did. Enel also told him a bit more about the war that had happened, and how the world was in a strange state at that point. To say that Bellamy was overwhelmed by all of that shocking information would have been an understatement. He simply couldn't wrap his head around most of the things he was hearing. He could somewhat believe that Enel was now an emperor of the sea. He still remembered with how much ease he had taken down every single pirate in Jaya, but the fact that the world had changed so much was simply not something he expected. I hope Luffy is okay. After his loss to Luffy, Bellamy had been really downtrodden, almost dying to Enel made things a lot worse. But something did give him hope. Or courage, would be more accurate. As he stood there half-conscious between the bodies of the pirates he had once been ruling over in Jaya, he heard it. The bell of the legendary Sky Island. He saw the shadow reflected upon the sea, and he could tell what had happened. Luffy made it. The Sky Island exists. He was instantly filled with an overwhelming amount of admiration for Luffy. Even when being loaded up in a marine ship, he couldn't contain his excitement. Bellamy could easily remember how confident Luffy had been. Even when every pirate in Jaya scorned him and laughed at his ridiculous goal, he still listened only to his heart. And Luffy's confidence had sparked Bellamy's own. Enough for him to go and search for the Sky Island himself after Doflamingo freed him and his crew, or what remained of it. After a while, Bellamy finally took a deep breath and looked back at Enel, before his gaze burrowed down a bit. This man. He may be lying to me. I can't divulge how I reached this place, it's the only leverage I have at this point. I'm sure I'll get Tortu. By the way, there are around 3 ways to get to this island. It's not like I don't know them. I was just asking out of curiosity. Bellamy gulped a bit when hearing that. Shit. Wasn't this place supposed to be secret or a legend? Enel smiled a bit when seeing his reaction. He could somewhat tell what Bellamy was thinking just by reading his expression a bit. This place is hardly accessible. All of the ways one might use depend on luck, a lot of luck. The chances of a crew reaching this place through any way other than the knock upstream are lower than 1%. If they even manage to find them in the first place. Bellamy sweated a bit as he remembered how Luffy's ship flew to the clouds. If the knock upstream was considered the safest, then he didn't want to know what the hardest method was. The Sea of Clouds is fragmented in any other entry point besides the knock upstream. The smallest miscalculation will send you tumbling to the sea 7 kilometers below. I am just curious about how you got here. I already know that one can technically reach this island. After all, some few people have done it in the past. At that point, Bellamy sighed, and he started speaking. He knew there was a possibility of Enel lying to him. But he doubted Enel had anything to gain from someone like him. Besides, he had been treated really well during his stay on the Sky Islands. He was kept fed, he had a roof over his head, and a warm place to sleep in. Sure, he was chained up, but that was just because he had tried to escape a few times. Bellamy ended up telling Enel about how he and his crew had managed to find a strange large bird while out searching for a method to reach the Sea of Clouds. Bellamy wanted to eat it, so he and his crew followed it more and more, straying from their goal a bit, all until a large tsunami appeared overhead. Through sheer luck, their ship somehow managed to sail alongside the tsunami, riding it into the sky, and when they had reached its highest point, a large sea king emerged from it as well. Bellamy tried to punch it, but the Sea King didn't seem too bothered. It proceeded to slap their ship away, catapulting it further into the sky, through one of the holes in the sea of clouds, just large enough that their ship fit through it. And just like that, Bellamy the hyena had forcefully arrived on the sea of clouds. Bellamy was excited when he realized that he was sailing in the sky, although their ship was close to sinking. Nothing a few emergency repairs couldn't fix though. Yeah, no, their ship was in shambles. Bellamy and his crew all survived on 2 rowboats. They proceeded to row randomly through the sea of clouds, somehow avoiding all of the holes, whirlpools, and rowed all the way to Heaven's Gate. The pirates got really excited when seeing it, realizing that they were rather close to the fabled Sky Island. Too bad their excitement got to them. They rushed a bit too much and were taken down after being branded as criminals for being unable to pay the entrance fee. Bellamy was somewhat strong, but he was also injured. He really stood no chance against Wiper's burn bazooka. Well, that about sums up our adventure. Enel blinked a few times as he tried to process what he had just heard. That was the most convoluted way he could have used to get to this island. How the fuck is he alive? No one could really fault Enel for thinking like that. It was literally a 1 in 100 lifetimes situation after all. Both lucky and unlucky at the same time. Understood. Well, that's one way to do it, I guess. Enel said as he scratched his chin a bit. I am unsure if that was a method anyone would think of. Bellamy said as he tilted his head a bit. Did you at least get to eat that strange bird? Enel ended up asking, as he picked his nose a bit. Unfortunately no. Bellamy sounded quite sad when saying that. That's a shame, Enel said, a bit disappointed by the situation. At a nobleman at. Anyway, you likely aren't going to be kept here for much longer. Enel then spoke as he leaned back on his staff. Am I allowed to go free? Bellamy seemed to instantly become excited at that. No. Well, in the future you will be. You will remain cuffed for a while. Your task will be to help defend the island from now on. But I can't do much with Seastone draining my powers. Bellamy said as he smiled a bit when hearing that he'd be let out of his cell. Don't worry about that. You will also be trained. Now, isn't that amazing? Enel clapped his hands as he turned around. Anyway, I'll make the arrangements. I'll visit sometimes to see if you're behaving. Till then, Enel didn't bother to wait for Bellamy's response, simply leaving the small-time pirate flabbergasted in his cell. Well, that was certainly informative. That's one way to call it, I guess. Chapter 106. Gathering in News. Blank. POV narration _ blank. Enel didn't spend a lot more time on the Sky Island after arranging for Bellamy to join the Sky Guards. That was the defense force that he and Gonfall had been building up. The name was still a working process, but their purpose was already decided. They became a sort of secret police, and only the strongest of the few hundred people Garp was training could ever become actual Sky Guards. Those that did become Sky Guards would also be thought about hockey extensively, so the position was also a way to get much stronger. Of course, the Sky Guards were far from strong as they were now, as all members were still in the middle or the beginning of their training. But those with talent always distinguished themselves. Bellamy was to become an honorary member, also the only one with a devil fruit amongst the trainees. He and Wiper were likely the most talented among the people among the trainees, so they had the highest chances to become much stronger in the future. But there were also others amongst them. Some Sky people seemed to have a talent for observation hockey, or mantra, and quite a few people that joined the Sky Guards also had that talent. Enel was quite excited to see their progress after a few years. He was confident that Bellamy would at least become strong enough to take on someone like Doflamingo. The only thing he was missing was Conqueror's hockey. Otherwise, he was talented in armament and observation, and his devil fruit gave him a lot of range of motion and was quite versatile. I have high hopes for him. Let's hope he doesn't disappoint. One of the other impressive things to have happened in his absence was Francisco's recovery. Well, as recovered as he could get. In just a bit over 2 months, his body was now filled with muscles. He had gone from a skeleton to an actual beast. Although he was nowhere near his prime, he could still cut a few ships in half with a swing of his cutlass. The blacksmiths of the Sky Islands had built him a special type of gauntlet, which would permanently fasten his grip on a specially made cutlass when coming in contact with the hilt. The contraption was feeble in a sense, as it wasn't anywhere near as strong as Francisco's natural grip strength could have been. But it at least gave him the option of properly wielding a blade. With his hockey, he was already a force to be reckoned with, probably even capable of defeating most Yonko commanders. Francisco had also taken in around 5 students, including Wiper, which were shaping up to become monsters. All of his students were also sky guards, which only served to show how high his standards were. Enel was pleased though, as all of his students were bound to become pillars of support for his sky island in the future. Enel departed from his base after arranging everything, turning into a lightning bolt and zapping in the direction of Baltigo. He stepped onto the island rather quickly, the journey not even taking him 10 minutes. He didn't really rush that much though. The first thing he wanted to do was to visit Robin, to see how she was faring without his training, but he stopped in his tracks when he noticed that he couldn't sense her anywhere near her home. He didn't think much of it though, just spread his senses across the entire island and found her almost instantly. She was in Dragon's office, with a few others. A small meeting by the feel of it. Enel was curious, and he also needed to visit Dragon, so he figured that he'd join in their meeting. The members present were Robin, Dragon himself, Sabo and Lurthi. Enel assumed they were just speaking about Robin's classes or something. He didn't bother listening to their conversation, as he was going to join it anyway. And with a spring in his step, he turned into a small bolt of lightning and reappeared in front of Dragon's office, only knocking on the door once before being led inside. Hello everybody. Did I miss anything? Enel's voice sounded cheerful, and his face displayed a smile, which quickly became a bit strained as he realized that the situation in the room wasn't all that great. Enel, it's great to see you drop by. Dragon said as he fixed his gaze on the skyfaring emperor. What's with the frowns? Did something happen while I was away? Enel got straight to the point, as the other people in the room seemed to still be in a bad mood. Well, we just received some news. Quite concerning news, if I do say so myself. Dragon said as he flipped through a few papers on his desk. The world government made a strange move quite recently. Robin said as she looked at Enel for a bit, her eyes sizing him up for a bit before she turned her head away and looked at the ground. You mean the whole thing with Fuchsia Village? No need to worry about that. I already made sure they won't be found by the world government. Even if the Sky Islands and Fuchsia residents are found, the world government would just end up regretting that they found them, now that Garp and Francisco are staying there. Well, as long as they don't end up pointing one of their Pluton cannons at the sky. Well, that was also a bit shocking to hear. Some more recent moves are concerning, to say the least. Sabo said as he scratched the back of his head. It seems they are trying to gather and collect all of the poneglyphs held by other kingdoms and store them in the Holy Land. Lurthi said as she rubbed the bridge of her nose. Her deep blue eyes seemed tired beyond belief, almost as if she hadn't slept in quite some time. Robin's looked similar, but she seemed a lot less stressed with Enel around. What the hell? Enel said as he finally processed the news he had just heard. It's very likely that the world government became aware of our efforts to find out more about the Void Century. And they are doing their best to actively prevent us from finding more through whatever means they can, Sabo said as he ran a hand through his golden hair, his round eyes looking a bit downcast. Were we too obvious in our operations? Does our information network have a rat scurrying around in it? Dragon seemed quite troubled as well. Enel merely crossed his arms as he tried to remember more about the poneglyphs other countries possessed. Royal families might have had the duty to keep the poneglyphs in their possession safe. There are plenty of them sprinkled in the world, but there are also plenty being held by these royal families. This is something passed down through generations, but I doubt the world government cares about tradition. And the royalty that held on to the poneglyphs before just accepted this? Enel asked with a raised eyebrow. The world government might have not cared for tradition, but most royal lines certainly did. There is nothing they can do against raw power. The world government can easily silence any complaint of theirs. If a royal family misbehaves, they will easily get replaced. Robin said as her mood seemed to only be getting worse by the minute. I guess. The public wouldn't usually agree to a change in leadership, at least if they like their leaders. But I'm guessing the public and its opinions don't matter much to the world government. Enel said as he rubbed his chin with his earlobe, his hands still crossed at his chest. Indeed. We could try to intercept some of the cargo ships carrying the poneglyphs, but I also fear that some of them will be bait, and I don't wish to sacrifice my men needlessly. We need a way to distract them somehow. Something that would force them to concentrate their efforts elsewhere momentarily. But that will be difficult to find. Dragon said, as his nose scrunched up a bit. I can provide you guys with a proper distraction. Enel said after taking a few seconds to think in silence. Do you have any ideas? I mean, they are likely expecting to be attacked physically, they must be prepared, so I don't know what that would accomplish. Sabo said as he rubbed the back of his head. Well, the attack I had in mind was less than physical. Enel smiled deviously as his eyes also narrowed. He turned his head to Dragon without wasting much time. Dragon, would you be able to get me in contact with Big News Morgan? Enel said as his smile seemed to grow larger and larger. At nobleman at. Dragon's eyes widened a bit when hearing that. He rubbed his chin, before his smile seemed to mimic that of Enel. I'm sure Morgan will appreciate some juicy gossip. I hope whatever information you have is enough to cause a large enough stir. Dragon said in a hopeful tone. It should be. I can barely wait, Enel said while rubbing his palms and earlobes together. I'll give you the location of the headquarters of his news station. He spends most of his time there. Dragon said as he walked over to a wall that displayed a map of the world. Perfect. I'll get to it right away. I've no doubt he'd like to have an interview with an emperor published. Enel's smile didn't die down one bit as he started walking towards the door. Oh yeah, if possible, tell him to rush with the publishing of his piece. We need to create a stir in the next week if we want to be able to intercept as many poneglyphs as possible. Sabo said as he turned towards Enel and waved a bit. Lurthi also sighed, somewhat glad that the shitty atmosphere got replaced, looking at Enel with a bit of admiration. I guess he's the guy to go to when you need to mess with the world government. By the way, the information you requested waits for you in your house. Though I'm guessing you'll check it out later. Robin said as she sighed a bit, somewhat glad that Enel had some type of plan. Hey, I'll take care of that later. I have a bird to talk to right now. And just like that, Enel vanished. Chapter 107. Robin and a Talking Bird. Blank. Pav narration underscore, blank. After Enel's departure from Dragon's office came quite a lot of strategizing. Dragon looked at the map on his wall with a small grin, as he marked down the location of every shipment that they had reports on. We will intercept all of them. Each group needs to have at least 2 Vice Admiral level fighters in it. Dragon said as he crossed his arms at the map. We need to pull out all the stops, get as many poneglyphs as possible, Sabo said as he joined Dragon in planning out the squads. Let's focus more on copying the writings from every poneglyph. They are heavy, and will be annoying to carry around. Lurthi said as she looked at the map from the couch. Parchments with copies of the poneglyphs are really all we need after all. If we are able to steal the whole thing, then it's good, but it's better if we don't risk too many revolutionaries on this. Robin gave her 2 cents on the situation as well. The world government making a move to restrict the ancient script and poneglyphs even further was something she found extremely concerning. The only good thing in that entire situation was that she was with a group that had the means to interfere with that to some extent. Although, without Enel, they certainly wouldn't have been able to do as much. He does always seem to have something planned. Though I guess some situations still are outside of his expectations. Robin clearly remembered how Enel had departed towards Fuchsia village. She only managed to catch a glimpse of him speaking to Dragon while in the sky, before he vanished. I kind of miss his training. She wasn't exactly mad that he forgot about her training. She was already taught how to perform a few of the 6 powers, and there wasn't much else needed besides that. She didn't have a high chance of awakening either armament or observation in the 2 years she had, so she decided to just focus on the 6 powers. Going by Enel's words, who knows? They might just awaken naturally in the future. Focus on the basics for now. She obviously took his advice to heart. He was one of the strongest people alive, and powerful enough to directly go against the world government. Even though she was always getting injured, her sparring with Enel had somewhat become the highlight of her day during the weeks he spent with the Revolutionary Army. Sabo also agreed to sometimes spar with her in Enel's absence, though Robin did notice her progress becoming much slower regardless of that. Sabo simply wasn't tough enough during training, though he still instructed her properly. She simply didn't have the same incentive to give it her all without someone that was willing to fight her properly. His training was a bit brutal even after he decided to take it even easier on her, but Robin still appreciated it. Even though Enel was always holding back, he didn't hesitate to beat her up if she made any mistakes. I wonder what distraction he has in mind. I've heard about Big News Morgan's, but I don't know how useful he will be now. Robin rubbed her chin as she sighed in the end, and gave up on that thought. I guess we'll just have to rely on him. While Dragon and Sabo continued strategizing, Enel was already well on his way to the headquarters of the World Economy newspaper. The location of the headquarters was actually quite interesting, as they weren't based on an island or ground base. Their headquarters were on a large blimp, which tended to never have a fixed position. Sometimes you'd find him in the Grand Line, sometimes in one of the 4 seas. Sometimes he'd just fly over the red line randomly. This time, Dragon managed to give him an area where Morgan's was seen recently. Somewhere near Wano, crossing over the red line. Enel proceeded to track the ship as best as he could, flying lines across the red line as he expanded his observation hockey as much as he could. Eventually, he found it. It was inevitable after all. The large flying blimp even had its logo. Enel didn't really know what to say about the flying contraption. It was really weird, somewhat fitting for Morgan's character. It was shaped like a teapot, a large silver teapot with an even larger balloon over it, held by ropes and metallic cords. The balloon was red in color, and it had the words, "We News" written boldly on it. Enel just smiled when seeing how secretive yet obvious Morgan's was with his base. He didn't even bother trying to hide the fact that it belonged to him. I guess there aren't that many teapot-shaped blimps flying around. Although it was just a news organization as a front, Big News Morgan's was actually a really large figure. An actual emperor of the underworld, with what was possibly the largest and most developed information network in the world, and ties to plenty of other pirates and government agents. That was the reason why the world government could never afford to get rid of him, regardless of how problematic he sometimes proved to be. He was simply too influential, and his disappearance or death would leave a large hole in the underworld, which would turn the entire world in disarray. Enel was rather excited to meet the man-bird. So he wasted no time in appearing in front of his ship and waving his hand. He made sure his appearance brought forth a loud thunderclap, to make the one steering the blimp catch sight of him. Enel waved for a few seconds, as the blimp seemed to stop in its tracks, right in front of him. "What do you want?" A high-pitched voice came from a speaker on the outside of the blimp. Enel scratched his head with a smile. "How about you let me in before we start the conversation?" Enel shouted as his earlobes and white furred cape swayed in the wind. "Fair enough. Come by the side, we'll open the door for you," the high-pitched voice said after a few seconds of silence. Enel just sighed and flew to the side of the blimp. The metallic door opened, and he entered in the next second, closing the door behind him with his earlobe. "Great. Thanks for opening the door." Enel smiled at the random employee that had been sent to do that. The employee's knees seemed to tremble a bit, as he nodded. Enel's smile became a bit strained when noticing that, but he didn't bother to bring it up. "Mind if you lead me to Morgan's?" Enel said as he tapped his staff on the ground, preparing to use it as a walking stick. Sure." The employee then led Enel through a few rooms, through the offices where dozens of employees were writing tabloids. Plenty of people seemed to be glancing at him. Everyone that noticed his presence seemed to either fear him or whisper something about big news incoming. Enel couldn't help but chuckle a bit at that. It only made sense for a majority of Morgan's employees to be just as special as he was. Though Enel had no doubt Morgan's was actually the most passionate about the subject. Enel also caught sight of a few more interesting people working there. They didn't seem like anything special at first, but Enel was able to tell that they were stronger than the rest of the people present. Likely CP agents and spies. Either that or Morgan's also has a secret fighting squad strong enough to match CP agents. Enel somewhat doubted the second part, but he just whistled while passing by those people, knowing that it wasn't the right time for him to deal with spies. Eventually, Enel reached Morgan's office, entering without any restraint as he ignored the guards at the door, who weren't exactly anything special, even weaker than the presumed CP agents on board. Big News Morgan looked just as Enel remembered him. A large white-feathered human albatross hybrid, wearing a blue top hat with a large striped feather in it, a light blue button-down shirt with a yellow bow on the top, red and white checkered pants, a dark cape, and shoes that fit his bird-like feet. At a nobleman at. I guess he doesn't stay in his human form all that much. Enel thought to himself as Morgan started the conversation. Amazing. To think I'd be visited by the most unpredictable figure yet. This is going to make the news. Enel simply sweated a bit when seeing how excited Morgan's was. A simple visit would be enough to make the news. Enel asked, tilting his head as he became a bit curious. He wanted to understand more about Morgan's mindset as soon into the conversation as possible, as it would be helpful to him in the long run. Of course, this is no simple visit. Just follow the footprints, the chain of events. You show up now that the world government started making large moves. This must mean you are bringing me great news. Morgan's rubbed his wings, hands together as his eyes shined and his beak curled somewhat upwards, smiling at Enel. His face is a lot more expressive than what you'd expect from a bird. I must say, you are quite astute. I guess this is to be expected of someone like you, Big News Morgan's. Enel said as he sat down in a chair in front of the news-hungry bird human. Indeed. Though, it wasn't that hard to figure out. Most people that follow your movements at this point should be able to tell that you have something against the world government. Morgans looked at the closed door behind Enel with narrowed eyes. Enel sweated a bit when hearing that. I guess I haven't been quite as secretive about my intentions lately. Although the world government tried to hide quite a few things that were related to Enel's involvement, Morgans and a few others were still able to find out that Enel was somewhat involved in most events related to the world government. All events either publicly ended badly for the world government, or the government hid them, which Morgan and the others in his field knew that it just meant they also ended badly. Morgan seemed to notice Enel's somewhat awkward stare, so he continued. Though, I guess I cannot blame you. They do tend to dip their fingers everywhere. They always keep the biggest news to themselves. HMPH, the gall and the audacity. The news should be for everyone to enjoy. And for me to profit off of its ratings. Enel smiled once more at that point. I guess he's still a businessman, Bird. Not sure. Indeed, news should be for everyone. And everyone deserves to know the truth. Enel said as he raised an eyebrow. Yes, yes. Now, what news do you bring me? Chapter 108. Grand Alliance and Big News. Blank. POV narration underscore, blank. Big news. Morgans didn't quite know what to say about an emperor visiting him. He was currently in the process of hiding a bit near the red line, as he planned to investigate a few recent events related to the world government, and he didn't want them interfering. Enel appearing was so outside of his expectations that he didn't even know how to react to it. But when thinking about it, it somewhat made sense for him to show up. As an emperor of the underworld, I am the one that should be able to spread the news around the world the fastest. He doesn't mean any harm, otherwise, my blimp would already be destroyed. Morgan had already run plenty of scenarios through his mind, and in the end, only one made sense. He has some dirt dug up, and needs someone to spread it. It was no secret in the underworld that Enel was going against the world government, so Morgans easily put two and two together. So, what news do you have for me? I'm already annoying the world government by snooping around. Publishing bad things about them won't change my situation much. In that situation, Morgans knew that he had nothing to lose at all. Even better, he'd gain a favor from an emperor, which was always a lifesaver in his profession. There was always the fear that the world government would start feeling that his existence's bad points outweighed the good ones, but Morgans knew that he wouldn't be killed as long as he hid properly for enough time. There was also something else bugging Morgans. The world government has been in power for too long. They've also made plenty of enemies. Maybe this time around it's truly coming to an end. Well, let's start with the incident at Dressrosa. I'm sure you have heard about that, right? Enel said as he smiled a bit, Morgans touching his beak with a thoughtful look. Yes. The story ended really quickly. Most of the information I received was when the situation had already concluded. I did manage to spread a video of you winning against Doflamingo, as I figured it would make for great news back then. Enel simply nodded when hearing Morgans. Indeed, well, I have actual evidence of the world government covering up the situation, planting evidence and taking away Doflamingo's body, Enel said as he put down the recording snail he had used to capture all of that on the table. Morgans' eyes widened when hearing that, his feathered fists clenching as if in excitement. Astonishing news. Big news. Certainly will make for good ratings. But, I don't think this will create quite the stir you want to cause. Morgans said as he stroked his beaked chin. Once more. Enel raised an eyebrow at that. He knew that the news of the Dressrosa cover-up alone wouldn't be enough to do it, but he had planned to reveal that and take some physical action as well. It's not that difficult to figure out. What you need is a distraction. A revolt, something to keep them occupied and distract them from their current endeavor. Morgans seemed to be thinking about something for a few seconds, so Enel gave him a bit of time as he tried to think of some other news he could give Morgans. Meanwhile, Morgans' mind was not exactly on the same issue. If I do help him, then I will basically side with him. Although I hope he'll succeed, do I really have any assurance? Morgans looked at Enel with a serious gaze, studying the Emperor with a skeptical gaze. No. Even if he fails, my days are numbered. If I want to succeed, I must do as I've always done. My intuition tells me that this man will reach far. And I've always trusted my intuition. Even now that my life is on the line, with him at least there is some chance of me surviving. Morgans he tapped the brim of his top hat, his serious gaze turned somewhat different, as he started looking at Enel with excitement. You see, I am willing to help you, and spread some rumors in the underworld as well. People will certainly scowl upon the deeds of celestial dragons worldwide. I have plenty of physical evidence and recordings of them torturing the populace. Not even slaves, just regular civilians. Morgan's beak shined as he spoke, making Enel sweat a bit. So he does have a lot of dirt on them. Why is he willing to give it away just to help me? At Nobleman at. I see, that would certainly cause a larger stir in plenty of places. But why are you doing this for me? Enel asked as he crossed his gauntleted arms together, staring at the bird human in front of him with narrowed eyes. Morgans merely chuckled, the presence of an emperor not affecting him even slightly as his smile widened in a devious manner. Someone like me can easily notice the hints. Enel, your actions haven't exactly been subtle to anyone even slightly involved in this. You are starting a war. This war only has two sides. Let's just say I am picking my side. I see. I appreciate the vote of confidence. I assure you that I will give my best. Enel said with a serious nod. Huahaha. I appreciate the fact that you are not lying. There can be no assurance of winning in this war, but as long as you vow to give your best, I am willing to aid you. Morgan smiled as he looked towards the door of his office. Enel also smiled, studying the office he was in a bit more, looking at the walls as he started thinking more and more about his abrupt alliance with Morgan's. I guess his position with the world government is a lot more fickle than I had thought. They really must have pissed him off with their interference in his business, otherwise, I don't know why he would agree to this. Then, Enel's smile retreated a bit, as he figured that he should also show Morgans that he was right in his choice. Morgans, I am glad that we came to an understanding. I will gladly accept any help. But I feel I should warn you, the Queen of the Pleasure District is not someone that you should be making deals with. Enel said as he remembered Stussy, another empress of the underworld that Morgans was in a business relationship with. I am surprised you know about my associates. I guess you also did your homework before coming here. Morgans smiled even more when saying that. Of course, I know about her. I don't make deals or alliances with people I can't trust. Enel said as he gave Morgans a sly look. The bird human simply cackled a bit, his confidence in Enel raising a bit more. It's better that the person going against the world government is intelligent rather than a bumbling fool asking for help from all sides. Stussy is a CP0 agent, likely one of the highest ranks in the entire Shipei poll. Her speciality is espionage and information gathering. Enel said as he tilted his head, one of his earlobes stabbing a photo of her into Morgan's table. Quote. That's. Morgan's eyes widened when he heard that, his beak turning downwards into a frown. That would explain quite a few things. Morgans then touched his beak thoughtfully once more. Enel simply smiled at that. I guess he also suspected her. He probably noted some of her suspicious behavior in the past. Maybe that's why he doesn't feel the need to ask about proof. Which is a good thing, as I don't have any. Enel knew that digging up proof of Stussy's link to the world government would be extremely difficult and time-consuming, so he was basically relying on his reputation as an emperor to give that piece of news. Since Morgans didn't hear any evidence from him either, the bird human also assumed the same, so he didn't press the issue. After that, their meeting didn't last much longer, with Morgans agreeing to publish the dirt he had on the world government the following days. He also agreed to cut all ties with Stussy, trusting Enel's words and his own intuition once more. Before leaving, Enel also did him a favor, snapping the necks of the CP agents that he had on board. They weren't all that hard to spot, at least for Enel, who had already killed hundreds of them. He could tell how they carried themselves, the methods they used to hide their abilities were also obvious to him, an actual master of observation hockey. It wasn't just that he could discern them due to their personal strengths though. There were plenty of factors and hints that Enel was able to pick up. The spies were good at what they were doing, the problem was that they were too good. They were doing their work in an almost robotic way. They were too methodic, their interactions with others too perfect. So, Enel picked all of them off. The majority of them didn't even get the chance to think about fighting back. Only the last one got the chance to release a Rankyaku, which would have cut the ship a bit had Enel not just casually blocked it with a blackened palm. Enel sighed for a job well done, ignoring the shocked and scared looks of the other employees as he continued to walk off while whistling. The reaction of the employees was understandable though, as they had just watched 6 of what they thought were their own people die in front of them. Enel wasn't bothered with them, Morgans would handle the explanations. Morgans appreciated Enel's efforts to clean his news station of CP agents, which basically solidified Morgans's confidence in the side he had chosen. But the fact that the world government had placed that many agents in his HQ angered him quite a bit. So, if they are willing to go that far, Then I should also go all out. Morgans was just going to publish some random facts about celestial dragons, coupled with a bit of evidence. But now he was angry, and just that much simply wouldn't cut it. They'll always find excuses about things related to world nobles, they will always be able to explain everything with the fact that the world nobles have all the right to do whatever they want. Little shits. Let's see how they explain away this one. And just like that, Morgan started brewing a storm, the perfect piece of news that could both destabilize the government and give Enel a chance to do what he wanted with the poneglyphs. The name of that piece of news? Well, Chapter 109. Room for Improvement and Waves. Blank. Pav Enel underscore, blank. Hey, who knew Morgans would be so agreeable? At Novelban at. Having him as an ally should make things run quite smoothly for now. I also need to make a small adjustment to my plans. I was planning to throw some lightning over at the Holy Land, and kill a few world nobles to create a stir alongside the news. That would have certainly made them send more troops to the Holy Land. But now I no longer need to risk my life to create a distraction. If I was to attack the Holy Land, maybe I would have managed to do some damage, but that city is also the best defended place in the world. From what I managed to gather, Kazaru is now a permanent protector in the Holy Land, so I can expect any pot shots taken from a distance to be intercepted by his lasers. I'd have at most 1 or 2 hits landed before all of them are cancelled out by laser beams. But he isn't even close to being the only person on that island that I need to watch out for. There is also Kong, the world government's commander-in-chief, also former Marine Fleet Admiral, the one before Sengoku. There are also Aokiji, Sengoku and Akainu. Even if we're on somewhat agreeable terms, their situation still forces them to aid the world government. It's either that or start an uprising in the Marines, where they'd end up killing a lot of their own men off. The worst of all is certainly still I am though. I don't even know if I'll survive fighting him. He and Kong are both question marks, but I at least know what to expect from Kong, just a regular Yonko level fighter at most. I can deal with that. But I am as a complete wildcard, the leader of the world, the one that sits on the empty throne. I don't feel prepared to face him by myself. It's hard to tell what he can pull and how strong he really is. I expect him to be able to kill me as I am now though. There are plenty of powerful people in the Marine and world government, but he is by far the strongest from what I am able to gather. My knowledge of the series ends a bit after the point where Luffy defeats Kaido. A lot of questions are still left unanswered by the show. So I will have to seek the answers myself. But at this point, it's fair to say that I am far from prepared to fight the world government directly by myself. I am not that much stronger than Kaido, and that's just due to my devil fruit. I can kite him and constantly damage him with lightning beams, his dragon form only makes him a bigger target for me. But I don't know if that works on IM. Even if it does, it takes only one mistake to mess up my entire fighting style. If any fighter near Kaido's level is to get too close to me, I'd likely die in 2 or 3 hits. Thankfully, I still have plenty of room for improvement physically, and I should still have time. For now, learning the advanced forms of Haki and figuring out the issue with my soul and Conqueror's Haki should be the priority. After handling this whole mess with the poneglyphs, I need to get my shit together and look into the information Dragon already supplied for me. Well, better head back to Baltigo for now. I'll help the Revolutionary Army recover some poneglyphs after Morgans publishes his hit piece. I just hope it will be enough to create a large enough uproar among the populace and royalty of some countries. That's all we need really. Blank. Pav narration. Blank. Enel reached Baltigo rather quickly after his talk with Morgans. He didn't go into many details, but he did mention that Morgans was now taking their side in the upcoming war. Dragon was rather excited to hear that Morgans was now assisting them and completely cutting off the world government. After all, Morgans was a largely influential figure. What he chooses, many will follow. There were bound to be plenty of underworld kingpins and emperors coming to their side the second Morgans made his stance public. At least that was what they hoped for. In regards to the distraction, Dragon was barely containing his excitement. He was also curious about what Enel had given Morgans to convince him to create an alliance. Enel waited patiently to get his hands on a newspaper. As he waited, he also got to read more about a few gods and started highlighting the religions that interested him from the information that was gathered at his request. The world of One Piece had actually hundreds of religions recorded in that world, and dozens were still actively being practiced. And that was just from what Dragon's agents were able to gather. There were bound to be plenty of undiscovered religions in unexplored islands, marks of old civilizations that fell to the flow of time. Enel was hoping to be the one to discover many of them in the future, but now he had to focus on his goals. Enel was also able to find a lot of interesting information on souls, and the way they worked. There were plenty of beliefs and theories regarding that, but one thing was quite apparent. Souls were very real and quite tangible in the world of One Piece. Even older inanimate objects and plants had souls, everything from trees to blades to ships to articles of clothing, apparently. Enel was rather fascinated to read more about that, and the many phenomena surrounding souls. But he wasn't able to find any situation similar to his along the examples that he had gotten to read before stopping himself. Why did he stop himself? Well, Morgans had managed to publish his hit piece rather quickly, and as soon as revolutionaries got their hands on the newspaper, he was instantly called to Dragon's office. Dragon, Lurthi, Robin and Sabo were there, each reading a newspaper with shocked faces. Enel was a bit confused at first, but then his eyes caught sight of the title on the front of the newspaper. The Tragedy of Ohara. The Ones That Sought the Truth. Enel's smile trembled a bit when reading that to himself. Morgans. That crazy bastard. Excitement quickly took over, as he grabbed a copy of it and started reading the rest of the article as well. It wasn't just an article, that entire rendition was used to tell the world about the story of the people that had lived in Ohara, to tell people about their dreams, and the legacy they had left behind. It told the story of an island of people known for their curiosity and intellect. People that sought to discover more about the world, more about the people that had once lived in it. And to do that, they looked to the past. They deciphered the poneglyphs, the ancient writings that documented the secrets of the Void Century. Every event that had happened leading up to Buster Call was explained and iterated greatly, even going a bit into the findings of Ohara. Everything about the people of Ohara was documented clearly. But the second part became more blurry. The second part spoke about how they were massacred by the world government, how a Buster Call was called on them only because they sought to tell the truth to the world. It even showcased some pictures of the aftermath, burnt buildings, dried blood everywhere, burnt bodies. Enel noticed the lack of finer details in that part of the explanation, but Morgans managed to highlight one thing. The entire world was fooled into thinking the people of Ohara were criminals. They were demonized more so than any pirate in history. But they did nothing to deserve such an ending, yet the world allowed itself to be fooled. Even to the point where they hunted down a child. Ohara's last survivor, Nico Robin. Morgans seemed to have kept track of Robin's life for some reason, which made Enel raise an eyebrow. The newspaper didn't go into many details, but Morgans made sure to make everyone that had ever hunted her down feel like trash in that article. Especially the world government, which was responsible for everything in the first place. And the newspaper ended in a strange way as well. The government has had our world in its palms for the longest of times. They have been playing with our lives like we are meaningless. Maybe it's time for a change. But change won't ever happen by itself. If you wish for change, if you wish to honor the wishes of the ones that gave their lives for the truth, then fight for it. You are the only one that can ever hope to bring change to this world. A call to action. Not something that Enel expected, but exactly what they needed. The entire article made Enel feel speechless. He blinked a few times as he realized that all newspapers displayed the same story. From all news agencies. I guess he owned all of them behind the scenes. Besides that, the way that the news was structured, the details in which it went. It made Enel realize something. Someone from Ohara had supplied Morgans with information. Enel knew that it wasn't Robin. She would have said something if that was the case. But it was probably a researcher in Ohara. Someone that traveled a lot. Someone that didn't survive the massacre. Enel only knew of one person that fit all of those categories. Nico Olivia. Enel turned his head to Robin, who was still reading the news with wide eyes, somewhat petrified by what she was seeing. Single quote. It all makes sense now. Enel gulped a bit as he remembered more about Robin's story. She always struggled. She was strong and willful, and her grit was what allowed her to survive in that cruel world that saw her as a demon. But will and grit wouldn't have done anything to help her against the world government. It didn't make sense for a child to be able to hide her tracks from the strongest power in the world. Someone, behind the scenes, a person that likely not even Robin knew of, was assisting her. That was the conclusion Enel had reached, even back in his own world when he was merely an observer. The Revolutionary Army wouldn't have been able to do that. They were nowhere near as strong back then as they were in the present. And thanks to the newspaper he was reading, Enel finally managed to find the one that had aided her. Big news. Morgans, Emperor of the Underworld, and has been one for 3 decades. Likely a former associate or friend of Nico Olivia. He had both the means and reasons to aid Robin. Enel smiled as he realized that, but his smile was somewhat strained as he now had to get in touch with Morgans again. Robin will certainly want to meet this man. She is smart, she will come to the same conclusion I did as well. But that will come at a later day. This newspaper will create a lot more than a stir or momentary distraction. Better if we get to work as the storm is brewing. Chapter 110. Underworld and Response. Blank. POV narration. Blank. The news barreled across the entire world at breakneck speeds, and the world government was unable to do anything whatsoever, no longer having any manner of control over the majority of the news stations. After Enel got rid of the agents at his main news station's headquarters, Morgans had actually purged all of his other news stations, laying every employee off completely and only working the printing press to publish that final newspaper. The world government may have noticed something odd, but they had no way of knowing just how badly and quickly Morgans was going to destroy their reputation. In every city, every village, everywhere that the news coup could reach, the newspaper spread out in the entire world at once. The world government did the best it could to suppress it, but they were completely unable to. The entire underworld had seemingly turned against them in a single day. Morgans pulled a lot of strings to make everything happen in such a short time. But, somehow, he managed to make anyone worth anything in the underworld no longer want anything to do with the world government and its agents. This manifested in Stussy, the queen of the pleasure district, being dethroned. As her ties to the world government were revealed by an anonymous source to the rest of the underworld emperors, she was quickly overwhelmed and shut down, basically banned completely and rendered unable to do anything or even perform even basic information gathering, which was supposed to be her speciality. Such a large-scale mobilization destabilized the underworld completely, but it controlled chaos. Merely a facade as others raced to fill in Stussy's spot. It was clear to anyone in the know that the one behind that move had been planning it for a long time. And the world government knew who that person was. Morgans. One of the 5 elders smashed his fist on the table as his chair also cracked underneath him. Quote. This is the worst possible timing for such betrayal. One of the calmer members of the 5 elders said as he looked at a map of the world that stood in the middle of their table. And we had a deal with that backstabbing bird. To think he was planning something like this. The reactions were varying in the room, but all of the 5 elders felt about the same inside. Rage. But also shame. They had greatly underestimated Morgans and the amount of damage he was capable of causing them. In the first place, that bird had a lot more influence in the underworld than we could ever expect. It is Stussy's failure for not looking into him better. One of the elders nodded in a sagely manner, hiding his rage perfectly. She was ordered to keep him close and survey his moves. But I guess Morgans was actually the one keeping her close and studying her every move. It can't be helped, she will be punished for this. She may be one of our best, but this is a colossal failure on her part. Even if Stussy was their best agent, they still couldn't possibly excuse her for missing the mark to such an extent with Morgans. Despite being an emperor alongside a few others, including Stussy formerly, he actually turned out to be the influential person in the underworld. At least that was what the world government gathered from the massive shifts Morgans had created in the underbelly of the civilized world. They had no way of knowing that the Revolutionary Army had also aided him in his endeavors after Enel reported their alliance. At least they were unable to find any relation to the Revolutionary Army at that time. Regardless, the operation would have still happened without them, but it was a lot more brutal and widespread thanks to the revolutionaries. It was as if a large part of the world had just turned against them, a dangerous part that they had been trying to control for centuries. The underworld was always a ticking time bomb. This was to be expected at some point. But this timing is what bothers me most. Why did it have to happen now? Just when they were preparing to transport the poneglyphs and store them at the Holy Land, where they would be safe. It was an important step that they had decided to take after finding out that the revolutionaries were looking into them. The timing was just that bad for them. Due to that newspaper, in just a few days, there were revolts all around the world. Almost every large city in the civilized world was in an uproar, with people shouting for change. The regular people were pissed off. And Morgans's call to arms at the end had worked perfectly to stir the pot even more. And thanks to Morgan's efforts, the world government's grip on the underworld had completely slipped, with only a few agents in insignificant positions left to fend for themselves. Morgans's attack was swift, brutal, and decisive. The world government knew that they had a lot of work to do in order to create a new foothold for themselves in the underworld. This incident alone was bound to set them back a few decades. Even worse, They now had to stage something in order to take away attention from the newspapers. Something big, something that would make people forget about the news altogether. Well, at least a majority of the public. It would take decades for the situation to be forgotten completely. Thankfully, the world government was confident that the riots would end quickly. They were forced to spread out their agents in as many places as possible, with clear instructions to turn the revolts and peaceful protests into violent revolutions. That way, they could stomp them down violently. The problem with doing that was that now they had to postpone their plans to transport the poneglyphs, or at the very least greatly downscale them. Some were already in the process of arriving in the Holy Land, so the 5 elders were glad that they at least had some of them secured. At least until they found out they weren't as secure as they thought them to be. A marine came and informed them of the situation. Countless unknown parties are engaging several marine ships. Many of our people were injured. The one reporting this news was a loyal rear admiral. That news basically confirmed their largest worries. The revolutionaries are working with Morgans. It wasn't that hard to tell, the way everything was timed perfectly gave it away. Then news rolled in about most of their ship being attacked, even fully stolen at times. Usually, the attackers just fled the ship after a few minutes. They are after the poneglyphs. Not that difficult of a realization to reach either. But the 5 elders were so deep into other shit that they didn't even have the time to react to any of those attacks. At Nobleban at. The revolutionary army had mobilized all of their fighters, all of their resources to pull off those attacks. And Morgans had done the same to push them out of the underworld completely and create a worldwide riot they now had to contain. At the very least they now knew who their enemy was. At least now we know who our enemies are. Morgans is now on the same boat as the revolutionaries. One of the elders said after the rear admiral had left. A boat we will be sinking soon by the look of things. Another one felt the need to add that to the conversation, expressing his distaste for the hardships they were now going through. At this point, we might have to ask Lord I Am for his assistance. We are not to ask His Majesty for assistance with such trivial worldly matters. Most of the elders seemed quite reluctant to go to their leader for help. But the next piece of news did manage to change their opinions. The newest report they received spoke of a freak storm swallowing some of their ships, throwing agents overboard while ignoring the Marines sometimes on board. That alone made some of the elders anxious, as they all associated storms with someone at that point. Then the worst possible thing happened. The confirmation of their worries. A single photo of Enel with a notebook and pencil in his hand, looking back at the camera with a smirk. As if to spite them, he still wore the symbol of justice on his back. At that point, fears materialized. Enel is working together with the revolutionaries. And the elders had no other choice left. Let us inform Lord I Am of this. The elders were all in agreement, all of them walking quickly to the empty throne that stood at the top of the world. All of them kneeled in front of the long stairway leading to the throne, groveling as they didn't even dare to look in the direction of their lord after such failure. I Am's eyes stared emptily at a few wanted posters. This time many photos were on his wall, all of them filled with knives and swords. In the middle of it, all was Enel's wanted poster. It was so covered in blades that one could barely make it out. It was clear that I Am didn't quite like his interference with their plans. The other posters and photos lining the walls were of Garp, Francisco, Luffy, Ace, Whitebeard and Dragon, and even Bonnie. The last photo, and one that was added recently by the looks of it, was one of Morgan's. It also had some swords sticking out of it. I Am's eyes were slightly bloodshot as he held a newspaper in his hand and glared at it with hate. I want Morgan's dead. That was all that I Am said as his eyes then peered into the 5 people prostrating before him. Why yes, Lord. However, the situation became complicated with recent developments. It seems that Morgans is working with the revolutionaries, which may have joined up with Enel. The elder trembled while speaking, seemingly afraid. I Am was silent for a bit, his eyes narrowing a bit. Find Baltigo. And find Enel's main base of operations. I don't care how you do it, but do it soon. The elders didn't dare refuse that request, but all of them were sweating when they heard that order. And what the hell do we do now? Chapter 111. Chaos and Strange Occurrence. Blank. POV narration _ blank. While the 5 elders were looking into ways to fulfill I Am's request, the revolutionaries and Enel weren't sitting still at all. Foo. The CP agents heard a burst of high-pitched laughter as their crew fought a strange group of oddly dressed hairy men. All of them were wearing ballerina outfits, with the exception of one that was dressed in a winter coat and cut apart the agents using giant scissors. And the leader, A large and strangely proportioned man with an indigo afro wearing a purple leotard of all things with leather boots and gloves. The strange men seemed to dance around them, acting like ballerinas in the wind, as they kicked and tore the ship apart with ease. What the hell is TH? The high-ranking CP agent on board only got to half of his sentence before he got rudely interrupted. Hell wink. Ivankov fluttered his eyelashes, releasing a shockwave strong enough to blow apart half of the ship's deck as his laughter continued to ring. The understaffed CP agents had no chance to fight back. Their convoy was large, each ship was currently experiencing similar situations, maybe with fewer odd people aboard. Armies of revolutionaries motivated and strengthened by Bello Betty were tearing through the outnumbered CP agents on most ships. And some ships had to deal with individuals. Which was proving to be even worse. Ryu no Ibuki. Dragon breath. One ship's deck crumbled apart in seconds as Sabo sunk his hand into it, attacking the core directly and destroying the footing of all agents on board. They quickly tried to fly away using Geppo, like many others before them, only for lighting to target them the second they reached a certain point. A freak storm raged above their entire convoy, the clouds sparkled, daring anyone to take to the skies. The clouds became darker and darker, striking fear into the CP agents. The few pacifists they had around didn't help them either, as all of them were fried by lightning bolts before they even got to lock on any targets. The agents that dashed towards Sabo instead of flying up were the only ones that remained. Unfortunately for them, the results weren't much different. Sabo's blackened arms crushed the skulls of the agents with ease, sometimes turning their brains to mush without even cracking the skull one bit. But he wasn't exactly the most dangerous person to attack that convoy, despite the fact that he took down high-ranking agents with ease. Enel was dealing with a few ships by himself, lightning bolts clearing the agents aboard with ease, even the ones that tried to hide and suppress their presence through sheer willpower were being killed. Enel's radar was perfected now. When turned on, no one could sneak up on him or sneak away from him. He was rather pleased to see that it worked perfectly even against people that tried to hide away from observation, as that had been its main purpose. Enel smirked as he stared at the sky once more, to see his creation working as intended. A gigantic golden Viking ship, at least 200 meters long and 30 tall. It floated overhead, releasing more and more dark clouds from many holes along its sides as gigantic paddles rode at the air constantly, stirring the clouds. The gigantic ship was staying afloat with energy that had been stored in a special engine that Enel had managed to build in his free time. After clearing out the world government's ships and copying the contents of each poneglyph, the ship in the skies sank down to their level, clearing the skies and revealing around a dozen blimps, which quickly started their descent as well. A part of the revolutionary army embarked on Enel's ship, the rest embarked on the many blimps that had been hiding above the stormy clouds. The revolutionary army moved swiftly, steamrolling through each and every convoy they had information on. Enel was leading a part of the mission with his flying ship, and Dragon was leading another group with yet another set of blimps. Their attack was quick, going from convoy to convoy in a set route. They were to meet in the middle, after which the copies of the poneglyphs would be stored in Enel's ship. Attacking from the air was not something many of them were accustomed to, but they were still trained in doing so. Most of their operations were usually covert, so they wouldn't use such a strategy under normal circumstances. Most of the blimps were provided by Morgans through his underworld connections. After forming a pact with Enel, Morgans started aiding the revolutionary army directly as well. With both information and supplies. Now they were in the same boat, Morgans likely saw the support he gave them as an investment of sorts. He had somewhat figured they were with Enel after receiving their help in the underworld when trying to turn everyone against the world government. At Nobleban at. Now, the combined efforts of Enel, the revolutionaries and Morgans were proving to be a bit too much for the slightly unprepared world government. The losses the government suffered were great, with many agents dying at the hands of the revolutionaries. Some lives were also lost on the Dragon's side, but Enel's group was lucky to be led by, well, Enel. He was basically made for such situations. He had minimized the casualties on both sides of the war at Marineford. Taking care of a few revolutionaries was too easy for him. Enel's lightning controlled the battlefield, as his observation had already spread out everywhere. The storm clouds above fried every agent even close to killing a revolutionary soldier alive. The soldiers were obviously motivated by that, leading to them charging in and tearing apart the CP agents ferociously. After attacking all of the convoys on their path, Enel's group quickly headed for the meeting point, where they waited a few more hours and rested. Dragon's group was also in high spirits, sure they had taken some damage along the way, and one or two of their blimps were missing. But such sacrifices were to be expected. Apparently, Dragon's group had run into a lot of pacifistas, much more than Enel's group, which made things a lot more difficult. But Dragon was strong enough to take care of things at the end of the day. Rather, their casualties were extremely low thanks to the lack of numbers on the government's part. The Revolutionary Army was able to carry out its plan perfectly. But the rest of the world was suffering greatly. Pacifistas were ushered out to deal with the disturbance in Sabayati, leading to plenty of civilian deaths as the protest turned violent when an unidentified man shot at a marine. That situation was being replicated in many parts of the world, pacifistas only being sent out to deal with conflicts near the borders of the Holy Land. The rest of the world had to deal with casualties of both soldiers, police, and civilians. All of them were left to fight for their lives. The chaos that overtook the big cities led to many deaths worldwide, but the world government didn't care about that. They were still looking for a distraction for the rest of the world, something to get everyone's minds off of everything, and more importantly, looking for any clues on the location of Baltigo. After a bit of deliberation, the elders now assumed that Baltigo was likely also Enel's base. As they were working together and the elders had no evidence pointing to anything else. The only silver lining for them was that they now had a trail to follow. All of the convoys that were attacked in order gave them a clear line to where the revolutionaries were to meet up on the map. So all they had to do was follow the trail. But they weren't the only ones looking for Enel and his whereabouts. How does one find a single man in such a large world? King's eyes gazed at the sea, as he sat on a ship full of beast pirates, hunting down one person. He and Queen had split up to search for him, despite the fact that neither of them was fully confident in taking on Enel. At that point, he was mostly going around blindly, hoping to catch a glimpse of any flying golden ship in the sky. But it wasn't his lucky day, unfortunately. He followed any trail he could, but he simply had no inkling as to where Enel was supposed to be. Then something strange happened. The world seemed to tremble around him and his ship, as he looked at the sea around him in confusion. As some large sea king emerging or something. The entire situation felt like a sea quake. It was as if the seas were abruptly choosing a path for him. Then, the sea in front of their ship seemed to abruptly shift, angling itself upwards as King swore and commanded the ship to move forwards. I don't know where this is going. But our best choice right now is to go forward. I can always fly away if I need to. And so, King and his crew started ascending towards the clouds. Chapter 112. Mother's Past and War. Blank. Pav narration underscore, blank. Enel's ship cut through the clouds, as he sat on his golden throne, legs crossed and a book in front of his face. Sabo and Ivankov were currently busy partying with the rest of the revolutionaries abroad. Their mission had been a complete success, and now they were heading back to base. Enel ensured they weren't being followed, turning on his radar every 30 minutes and scanning the area as far as his observation hockey allowed. Thanks to that, Enel was confident no one was following his vessel. Which was good, as he was designated as the first ship to return to Baltigo, of which he was given a piece of Lurthi's Vivre card in order to navigate properly. Lurthi and her team couldn't do much to help the situation after the initial planning was over. Robin was also in Baltigo studying from their library. After all, even with the training from Enel, she wasn't exactly someone they wished to risk on the front lines. For now, their duties were to prepare for the few sleepless weeks that would follow after Enel delivered the poneglyphs to them. Dragon and everyone else had also split up. They were to all head back to Baltigo after doing a few loops and confusing anyone that was set to follow them. A few of the revolutionaries also stole some of the vessels, as they were useful ships and could either be destroyed for parts or fully resold to the right buyers. They also scattered in different directions, fleeing with some of the original poneglyphs and new warships for the revolutionary army. The ships that couldn't be taken from each convoy were simply sunk, letting some of the original poneglyphs also reach the bottom of the seas. Better for the fish and sea kings to have them than the world government. Were Dragon's exact words when strategizing how to cause as much damage as possible. There weren't many occurrences for Enel along the way. The only interesting thing to happen was Ivankov turning into a woman and inviting Enel for a dance, and calling him a boring party pooper, when refused. Although he was called that, the party still continued, and Ivankov even ended up hosting Enel up in the air by his chair and parading him around the ship. In doing so, he had basically ripped the chair from its initial spot and ripped all of the golden tubes connected to it. All was well, with Enel continuing to read his book as his chair moved around in the dancing crowd. All until the ship's engines started going slower for a bit and Enel punched him in the head for disrupting his connection to the ships, electricity, system. Ivankov woke up after a few minutes and continued to party without bothering Enel after that. Enel's giant vessel reached Baltigo relatively quickly, as its high-powered engines flew high above the clouds with speeds far exceeding any regular seafaring ship. Enel's eyes scanned the clouds once more before descending into the mist and landing his vessel near the main base on the island. The residents had already spotted them before the landing, they had already come out to greet them. Including Robin and Lurthi, who seemed to be conversing about something as they watched Enel's ship stop its engines completely. "I'm telling you, you look exactly like her," Lurthi said as her finger twirled around a few golden strands of her somewhat messy hair. Quote. This is not exactly what I expected to hear this morning. Robin rubbed the bridge of her nose in frustration as she looked at Enel's ship with a tired gaze. For a while now, Lurthi had been going on and on in her own mind about finding Robin familiar for some reason. Even during the whole mess with the war, the thought didn't quite leave her mind. She had been subconsciously interested in Robin ever since meeting her for some odd reason. It was just something about her mannerisms and calm demeanor that she found extremely familiar and quite soothing. And finally, after searching her mind a bit more, she finally remembered why she seemed so familiar. "You look exactly like Mother." Those were the exact words Lurthi screamed at Robin when she burst into her room. Robin was taken by surprise, as she had actually been sleeping like a regular person and not staying up the entire night trying to remember things. Quote. What was the only thing that came out of the groggy and half-asleep Robin? Lurthi then actually explained herself, thankfully. "Okay, so, when I was small, there was this lady running our orphanage. She looked really similar to you, but she had white hair. She wasn't really there a lot, but she's the one that raised me basically." Lurthi patted herself on the chest with a large smile on her face. Robin just stared at her for a bit, blinking a few times as her sleepy mind tried to process whatever it was that she was hearing. Quote. What? And so, Lurthi basically followed Robin around the entire morning, up until some members of the archaeology team dragged her off elsewhere. Robin didn't really know what to think of that at all. For most of her life, her mother was actually missing from her, as she traveled the world a lot. She had no idea what Olivia had been doing with her spare time. But from Lurthi's words, Olivia was apparently acting as a caretaker for an orphanage at one point. Well, she had funded and built the orphanage, giving street urchins a place where they could sleep comfortably and some warm food on their plates. Orphans of war were common in the world of One Piece, and Olivia had likely encountered quite a few disasters in her time as a traveler. The fact that she had ended up creating an orphanage and taking in various children didn't bother her. What bothered her most was that, from Lurthi's words, Olivia was visiting the orphans more than she had been visiting Robin back in Ohara. It wasn't that she was mad at her biological mother, there was no use in hating the dead. But Robin didn't quite like thinking about it either. She also didn't want to subconsciously start directing her displeasure in that matter towards Lurthi. She didn't feel the need to be jealous outright, she also didn't want to hate Lurthi because of it, the woman had been nothing but friendly to her during her time with the revolutionaries. Still, she felt a bit off when learning about that. An emotion that Enel of all people managed to pick up on rather quickly. She's a bit moppier than usual. Having spent so much time with Robin, he could somewhat pick up on her emotions and he could tell that she was in a relatively bad mood. Lurthi was a bit less receptive in that sense, as she was acting like her usual friendly self, only finding the fact that Robin looked like her mother to be extremely interesting more so than anything else. Enel let the revolutionaries unload everything from the ship, as he walked up to Robin and Lurthi with a small smile on his face. "Now, what have the two of you been up to?" Enel's head tilted slightly, his earlobes dangling a bit as he directed a comforting gaze towards Robin. Robin noticed that her face mustering up a strained smile as he looked over at Lurthi with a quizzical look. But Lurthi seemed to have no clue that that subtle interaction was even happening, as she just responded to Enel's question. "Our team has been preparing for your arrival. We are hoping for good news, obviously." Enel simply smiled at her, reminding himself that most bookworms weren't socially apt as well. He simply tapped Robin's shoulder and leaned down quite a bit, whispering to her ear. "We'll talk a bit later, okay?" Robin simply nodded to that, before shaking her head and recovering her stoic exterior. "Well, the good news is that we managed to get all of the convoys we had mapped out. The bad news is we've no clue if we've missed any." Enel turned to Lurthi and spoke with a smile. "No need to cry over spilt milk. If you've got all of the ones we had mapped out then everything should be good. I can't wait to get my hands on them." Lurthi clapped her hands together as the team behind her seemed to groan in frustration. Enel looked at them for a bit before smirking a bit. Hey, guess they have a lot of work to do now. Sucks to be them. I ain't helping. Now then, let's all get to work, shall we? Enel also clapped his hands, gaining more groans from the archaeology team except for Lurthi, who basically ran to the ship to look at the copied poneglyphs, unable to contain her excitement. While that was happening, unbeknownst to everyone, a large decision was made at the table of the 5 elders. So you want us to start another war? Akainu smashed his fist on the table as he glared at the 5 elders with rage. HMPH, you have no right to argue after losing so pathetically. In the last one of the elders said as he glared at the fleet admiral without any speck of fear. This is far too soon. The Marines have barely had a few months to recover. We don't care. You saw the news, Akainu. The world is twisting and turning because of that stupid newspaper. Akainu simply clenched his teeth, the anger in his gaze rising when hearing about the newspaper as well. Don't you dare protest any further, Sakazuki. We haven't forgotten about your failure to act upon a buster call a few weeks back. One of the elders narrowed his eyes at Akainu as he said that, making the fleet admiral meet his gaze defiantly. I already said that it was a technical issue. Akainu said, almost in a growl. HMPH, as if anyone would believe that. I don't care who you do it with, but I want you to start a war. And now, attack a Yonko territory for all I care, throw as many lives into it as possible, the bigger the loss of life the more impactful a news story it will be. Akainu at that point could only grit his teeth even more, to the point where his gums were bleeding slightly. As you wish, Akainu said as he strolled out and slammed the door behind him. These fuckers have no care in the world, do they? Akainu slammed his fist into a nearby wall, cracking it as his anger skyrocketed again. At it Nobleman at. He managed to calm down when seeing Aokiji, who was looking at him with a serious gaze as well. You heard it. We need to start a war now. Akainu said as he crossed his arms and huffed some steam from his nose. It seems they just want a distraction. Maybe if we are able to find something big enough to distract the public we'd be fine. Aokiji said as he put his hands in his pockets and started walking alongside Akainu. No. They specifically asked for war, the fuckers. They want some loss of life, a huge tragedy, so that they can sweep everything they did under the rug. Akainu said as he finally reached his office. They want a war, right? Akainu finally calmed down completely when he sat down on his chair. Aokiji in front of him just gave him a cryptic look, before nodding his head once. Akainu's lips parted into a wide smile, as his eyes blazed with volcanic rage once more. Well, let's give them war. Chapter 113. Research and Souls. Blank. POV narration _ blank. Enel collected his new golden ship into a pair of both gauntlets and a pair of golden sabbatons for his feet. The revolutionaries had given him a lot of gold for that operation, it was a payment of sorts for the help he gave them. Enel didn't bother to decline, as he saw nothing bad with having more resources to work with. He also had plenty of thundercloud dials in both his staff, sabbatons and gauntlets. Storing them was still just as easy. The only problem with storing the dials in his gauntlets and sabbatons was that if Enel was to clash with Kizaru, or any person at his level, most of the thundercloud dials would likely break on impact. At least the dials in the parts that took part in the clash. It wasn't ideal, but that could be fixed as long as his armament hockey got stronger. But before armament comes conquerors. I need to get on with my research. After that, I should also look into advanced hockey techniques. Robin had gone with the archaeology team. For now, she was likely going to be helping them for a while. Enel didn't forget about her, he still wanted to speak to her in private. But for now, they both had plenty of work to deal with. Enel himself had countless issues in his mind and a lot of things that needed to be addressed quickly, but the one that he had been postponing was the one he needed to start with. Let's hope that the information Dragon gathered is useful for my situation. And so, Enel got to reading. His eyes scanned through pages upon pages of information at impressive speeds, reading through the documents on his desk as quickly as he could, while also comprehending as much as possible. Being able to minimize study time was something that he had been quite proficient at in his past life. Now he got to do it all over again. It didn't take long for Enel to find a pattern in all of the information that was provided to him. In all of the religions, there was a general consensus when it came to spirituality and souls in general. Souls are not one simple construct, they are supposedly a complex construct made of different parts. The more he read on, the more that hypothesis was mirrored in every religion he had information on. After a mere few hours, Enel had gained quite a bit of comprehension regarding souls and the way they worked. At least from the information that he had been provided with. There was obviously more than one theory on souls and they functioned. One thing was clear though, souls obviously are deeply ingrained into this world's history. Powers directly affecting one's soul weren't uncommon, and plenty of religions were based upon their powers as well. It was rather fascinating for Enel to read that at some point in history someone with Big Mom's fruit had created an entire religion based around that fruit. It had been more than 400 years in the past, and most people had forgotten about it completely. The only reason the revolutionaries were able to find out about it was that they had managed to find a mention of it in an extremely old book. Soul Society. It had been called something akin to a utopia. No discrimination between races and powers, as to them only the soul mattered. Each individual was different in some way, but in their differences, they had found strengths. It was disbanded after gaining a bit too much strength though. Most likely by the world government. But there was no real mention of that either. So it was just a guess from Enel more so than anything. An educated guess as some would call it. Regardless, Enel was able to compile the most believable theory from the information he had read. Souls were specifically made out of 3 parts. The first part was the mind, it dictated one's own reasoning. The second part was the emotion, the spiritedness, often associated with bursts of rage or differing emotions. The third and final part was the desire, the appetite, rather self-explanatory, making up one's own desires. After compiling that information, Enel couldn't help but blink a few times, as he somewhat remembered the explanation. He continued to read it over quite a few times before he finally remembered where he remembered it from. It's the Platonic soul. The Platonic soul was a real theory that existed back in his own world, and it was eerily similar to the one that he was looking at right now. Plato's and Socrates, 2 Greek philosophers, also theorized that the soul was of 3 parts. The mind was called logos, or logistikon. The emotion was called thymos, or thumetikon. And finally, the desire was called eros, or epithumetikon. One other part of each theory seemed to match. The concept of rebirth. Souls would inherently be immortal. This is agreed upon in both theories. But an addition made by Aristotle also fits appears in the theory of this world. Only logos, the logical mind and the intellect were immortal. The emotion and the desire changed upon each incarnation of one's soul, but the intellect always remained the same. That led Enel to one question only. How exactly was my soul reincarnated into this world? Enel had all the reasons to believe that there was a soul in his body. Everything around him had a soul. Everything alive and even not alive could have a soul, so his living and breathing flesh certainly had a soul behind the wheel. At Nobleman at. Now, if the theory he uncovered was to be believed, and it certainly held some weight if it was present in both worlds, then only his mind could have been transferred over to Enel. Only his intellect and his memories would have been transferred over if he were to listen to every single part of the theory and believe it is true. But I also have my desires still. Wait, do I really still have them? He and Enel had long since become the same person. He felt as if his desires were reflected in that world as well. To find out the truth about the world and spread it to the entire world. His original soul's desires and interests were what sparked that goal. But did I have this goal before coming here? Enel asked himself as he looked around his bleak and boring room. Filled with scattered books and documents. In my past life, I've never truly cared much for revealing the truth to the world. I only cared about learning for myself, I cared not for recognition or wealth. So why? Why did I suddenly feel differently? Enel spoke out loud, to no one in particular, as he tried to wrap his mind around the way his existence worked. Were Enel's desires and emotions simply twisted to fit my mind? Enel said out loud as he had finally come to that realization. He blinked a few times before gulping a bit. The original Enel wouldn't have cared about the world. But he had a god complex, didn't he? It was at that point that things became clearer and more fleshed out in Enel's mind. The original Enel's god complex didn't allow him to think of himself as nothing other than righteous. That's how they always are. But he never really had a strong set of morals or values. Which led to him basically being a third-rate villain at best. So, his god complex mixed together with my morality, values and interests. Leading to this. The more he thought about it, the less he liked it, but it was the most logical conclusion he could come to. At least with the information he had at hand. Well, this whole theory would certainly explain why I became so comfortable in my new skin so quickly. Enel felt that, With that revelation, some of his own questions had been answered. My soul. It's not that it's missing. It's just incomplete. His current soul was a patched up work of bits and pieces of the original Enel's soul, stapled together to Alexander's logos, are his mind and memories. Single quote. But every part of my soul was altered, as I also gained Enel's memories. So it's more accurate to say that Enel never died. The original Enel just merged with me. Well, the parts of me that are here anyway. My mind overpowered his, and it seems to have put me in charge, in a sense. No, that isn't quite accurate. I am no longer either Alexander or Enel. I just became both. Their minds merged, but the other parts were different. What did the other parts of Enel's soul merge with? Mine should not exist anymore. It was a good question. After all, the God that had sent him there didn't want him to learn a lot about his soul. He had even prevented Big Mom from seeing it. No, it's simply impossible to tell at this point. I need to get in touch with Big Mom. She should hopefully be able to confirm or deny some of my findings. If she agrees to help me, that is. Enel simply threw the documents back into the pile with a sigh. Well, this certainly answers some of my questions. Though I've yet to find anything on how my soul affects my willpower. Single quote. Which part of the soul would be related to one's will, or ambition, the most? Enel didn't take long to realize that the answer was a lot more complicated than that. Desire and emotion both make up someone's will in a sense, same for intellect. How am I supposed to pinpoint this? In the end, Enel just sighed and figured he'd speak more about it with Big Mom. After he finished that train of thought, he rested his tired eyes for a few minutes, before hearing a knock on his door. Single quote. Robin. Chapter 114. Sharing and beginning. Blank. Pav narration underscore, blank. Enel somewhat expected Robin to come to him. He was the one that had extended the invitation in a sense. What he didn't expect was for her to drop by so soon. He had barely started resting his eyes a bit, and his room was an absolute mess as well. His usually silked backwards short hair was now messier than usual, and his shirt was unbuttoned as well. He didn't bother fixing those things though, nor did he bother tidying up his room. Well, no need to try and keep up any appearances with her. After so many weeks spent together, Enel knew that Robin was a person that appreciated honesty. And he also didn't feel like cleaning everything up so quickly, at Novelban at. Robin looked about as tired as when Enel had first seen her when arriving on the island. It still seemed like something was bothering her, but she also looked almost asleep. Single quote. I guess she's a bit cute like this. Enel blinked a few times, as he realized that was the first time he ever found a woman cute. He usually reserved the term for small children. But something about her just looked harmless. Yeah, that would be the right word. Robin, I'm glad you're here. I was going to visit you soon. Enel then looked at the dark sky above them as they stood in the doorway. Shit, how many hours was I studying for? I guess I was going to visit you tomorrow. He corrected himself as he scratched the back of his head and invited her inside his temporary home. Thanks, Robin said as she entered Enel's room and sat on his bed, ignoring the countless books and documents that littered the floor. Quote. Enel sat down, pulling his chair in front of her and looking her in the eye for a bit. The two of them awkwardly sat in silence for a while, before Enel finally spoke. So, are you going to talk about what's happened? Are the revolutionaries not treating you right? Enel asked as he tilted his head. I may be good at picking up social cues. But that doesn't mean I am great at comforting people. Guess I'll just have to wing it. Quote. It's nothing. I'm just being stupid. Maybe a bit childish even. I didn't think I was capable of that anymore. Robin shook her head, seemingly ashamed to even tell Enel what had happened. But it was clear that something was on her mind, and that she wanted someone to talk about it too. Otherwise, she wouldn't be here, now would she? But how exactly could Enel go about getting her to open up to him? You know, I've always looked at the world from a neutral stance. I've always been afraid to show my hand, in fear that the world would take advantage of that. So, he decided to open up a bit about himself. Whether it was studying, fighting, or archaeology. I've always succeeded in every field. But I've yet to actually ever feel fulfilled by any of my discoveries. My curious nature always prompts me to go forward, to try and uncover more. Ignoring dangers, and ignoring my own health at times. Enel crossed his legs as he started thinking more about his past, the way he had acted in his previous life. My curiosity has always been my strongest and most defining characteristic. It's what brought me where I am today. But I also fear that it will one day be the very reason for my death. Enel blinked a few times as he continued in his mind after a few seconds. It already has once. Robin looked up at Enel's face with a confused gaze. She seemed to think about a few things before sighing. But you still let your curiosity drive you forwards. Right? She asked, looking down at her legs. Quote. Always have. Probably always will be. I want to see how the world reacts to the truth, I guess. I want to know the truth for myself as well. All of my goals ultimately spawn out of curiosity. Isn't that somewhat self-destructive? What do you plan to do after achieving your current goals? Robin asked, raising her eyebrow as she looked Enel straight in the eye and tried to explore more and more about his mind and thought process. Well, I guess I'll have to live and see, won't I? Probably whatever else my curiosity turns towards next. Enel simply shrugged, breaking eye contact for a few seconds as his gaze became unfocused. It was at that point that Robin seemed to huff a bit. Well, maybe you'll find something else to live for afterwards. She coughed into her own fist as she also broke eye contact and looked around the room, her poker face not breaking for 1 second. Enel thought about those words a bit, before simply smiling. Maybe I will. His words rang in a much more confident tone, almost melodic and high-spirited. Robin coughed again, and Enel looked back at her, with a relaxed smile. Since you're willing to open up to me like that, I guess I should as well. Robin's words made Enel even happier, but she seemed to suddenly become fidgety, for some reason, rubbing her shoulder while breaking eye contact and looking at the ground. Well, I learned recently that Lurthi was technically raised by my biological mother, while I was being raised by my aunt and her family. Enel blinked a few times as he tried to remember details about Robin's childhood. Nothing was mentioned about Lurthi in the show, and Nico Olivia's life and adventures are about just as well known. Enel couldn't quite remember much about Nico Olivia, besides the fact that she and Robin had missed each other by seconds when O'Hara was destroyed. It's hard to tell if Olivia failing to find Robin on O'Hara actually saved her life. I see. Does that thought make you feel strange? Enel asked with a knowing smile, trying to get into her mind, to empathize with her as well as he could. I guess. It's not like I hate Lurthi or anything. Not like I hate my mom either. But I don't know. It just doesn't seem fair. Robin seemed to be in a worse mood the more the conversation went on, so Enel simply sighed. It's okay to feel like that, I guess. I've never met your mother, nor do I remember ever meeting my parents. But I can understand if you felt like this situation specifically is unfair. Enel smiled as he patted her back, trying his best to comfort her. Unfair. I guess that's the word I was looking for. Robin sighed as she rubbed the bridge of her nose. My mother, Nico Olivia, was a traveling archaeologist, you see. She didn't spend any time at home. She barely spent any time with me. So I found it unfair when I heard that she apparently had the time to raise an orphanage. Quote. Enel smiled even more when hearing that, only sitting down beside her and listening to her. Apparently, Lurthi even learnt a bit about poneglyphs from Olivia. She is apparently what sparked her interest in archaeology. Robin continued to speak more and more about her thoughts, and her feelings. She found it unfair. She didn't want to hate her mother, nor did she want to hate Lurthi. But she just wanted to complain. And Enel listened. He listened with a smile on his face, comforting her as best he could. Then, after a while, she felt liberated. The more she talked about it, the better she felt. Enel's understanding gaze and words helped her see her problems as important. It helped her feel like they mattered. In the end, before either of them even realized it, Enel's arm had stopped rubbing her back randomly, and just rested over her shoulder, pulling her to his chest into a hug of sorts. She didn't reject it, but she did pull away when feeling her heartbeat faster. Enel didn't mind though, he simply smiled. He opened his mouth, about to say something. Boom. An explosion rang throughout Baltigo, as Enel's eyes widened. The ground trembled as the foundation of his home seemed to rattle alongside it. Enel's hockey quickly spread out beyond the island's borders, as he felt the explosion had hit the right side of the island. In the distance, he could feel a number of unrecognized ships popping up on his radar as he also started spreading electromagnetic waves around him. Shit. Chapter 115. War breaking out. Blank. Pav Enel _ blank. The second the explosions broke out, pandemonium spread through the island. But not for long. The revolutionaries were not your regular citizens. Every person on that island was prepared for such a thing to happen. They had specific protocols for everything. And now, An alarm rang through the entire island, as countless ships approached the island, finally entering Enel's range as he started realizing the gravity of the situation. A buster call. No. This doesn't feel like one. A buster call only involves the Marines usually. The ships present were familiar to Enel, but they weren't all filled with Marines as they would usually be during a buster call. Instead, there were close to 1,000 pacifistas, coupled with hundreds of agents. Damn. Considering the number of pacifistas, they must have overworked Vegapunk to hell. And, the worst part by far. As front-liners, presumably, every powerful figure in the Navy was present, including some powerful people that Enel couldn't recognize through the radar. One of them is slumped a bit and is using a sheathed sword as a walking stick. And the other one is standing tall and wearing a pair of sunglasses of some kind. It's hard to tell for the second one, but the first one is certainly Fujotora. Did they get recruited this soon? Enel was annoyed by that. He had planned to extend an invitation towards Fujotora himself at some point. He knew that the admiral didn't have much respect for the world government, so he could likely be persuaded to work against it with enough work. The other new admiral, Ryokugyu, wasn't as interesting to Enel. He was a zealous believer in the world government, and it was likely impossible to persuade him of anything, even with actual proof. Well, no use crying over spilt milk. He would have been useful, but I don't care either way. There are plenty of powerful people to recruit in the world. Akainu and the others were also there, including Sengoku, which made Enel realize that the world government was really going all out. Every vice admiral and every admiral prospect was also present, including Gion and Tokikake, who were both actual admiral level figures when it came to actual strength. What the fuck is wrong with them? To mobilize so many people? Are they leaving the Holy Land undefended? Enel stopped and pondered that for half a second, before shaking the thought out of his head. No. Kong isn't here, and I is also still in the Holy Land, just him alone is likely all the protection the Holy Land needs. The Navy and world government are attacking the island. How much time did I spend reading anyway? Enel asked out loud as he blinked a few times. Quote. It's been 2 days since you arrived on this island, so I'd say about that much. Robin said as she also looked rather panicked. I'll make sure to buy enough time for you all to flee. You should head to the south, the revolutionaries should be gathering there anyway. Take a blimp and stay safe. Enel said as he buttoned up his white shirt and put on his furry coat. Still, I don't see how the situation can turn any shittier. Enel said out loud as the two of them quickly started walking out. Then you better stop talking, wouldn't want you to jinx it. Robin said as her mouth turned upwards into a smile. Usually, she would have been scared in that situation, but being near Enel gave her a sense of safety. But the situation was still somewhat worrying to her. Even with Enel's power as an emperor, she was still unsure if he would be able to save everyone in the revolutionary army. Also, you should stay safe as well. You may be strong, but you're not invincible. Robin said as she looked at Enel with a serious gaze. I may not be invincible, but I am far from easy to deal with. I can deal with whatever they throw at me, you just make sure to escape in time. Enel's words were accompanied by a calm smile, exuding confidence. That smile simply made Robin sigh a bit, as she turned around and looked at her home. I'll go get my things. Good luck. And just like that, Robin ran off, and Enel vanished as well, resting his staff on his shoulder as he took to the skies. In the skies, he formed his ship, charging it to stay in the sky for at least 10 minutes, and allowing it to create storm clouds constantly. This should at least even things out a bit. I don't know where Dragon is, but he's not on the island. I guess his blimp didn't come back yet. Still, Enel didn't quite understand how the government had found Baltigo. It had gone under the radar for many years already. Did they follow one of the blimps that came in after me? Enel pondered as he flew in front of the enemy ships, greeting them with a smile. Enel tapped the sea with his staff, spreading electricity across the entire sea around him, and raising a giant wave, blocking all of the cannonballs and giving the revolutionaries on the island some breathing space. I wonder how they plan on fighting me. The wave continued further, before being blasted apart by a barrage of lasers from the pacifistas. Figures. But what can they do about this? Enel then manipulated the water near the ship, circling around to the depths, and forming a giant whirlpool right underneath two of the ships. 200 pacifistas were sunk just like that, and Enel narrowed his eyes as his opponents acted in the way he had expected them to. The water instantly turned to ice, and he didn't bother to melt it, so now he landed on the edge there, standing in between the world government and Baltigo. I don't really like harming Marines. But all I need to do is buy enough time. Enel narrowed his eyes as his opponents all started disembarking, stepping on the ice with confidence. Hundreds of pacifistas formed a line right at the front, leading the charge as the Marines stood behind and looked at Enel with wariness. Why the hell is he here? Akainu thought to himself as he crossed his arms and huffed a bit of steam. Akainu had planned to carry out an attack somewhere else, to stage a war with the Big Mom pirates, who were somewhat weaker than the other Yonko still around. But just as he was about to look into ways to start the war publicly, he and his forces were forced to move. Everyone was pushed to act and attack Baltigo, as a top agent of the Cipher Pole had managed to locate it. Akainu accepted in the end, as he figured the revolutionaries would be easier to fight than an emperor. Of the sea, Enel's appearance wasn't something he expected. It was the same for Sengoku and Aokiji, who were worried about something else as well. If Enel is here, doesn't that mean Garp is around as well? Thankfully for them, Garp was somewhat busy elsewhere. After all, the world government wasn't the only one starting a war. After all, while Enel was preparing to face the Navy and the forces of the world government, another person on the other side of the world was also gearing up for a war, of sorts. At Nobleban at. It had been a few days since King had started wandering around the Sea of Clouds, his ship had seen better days, and many of his men had lost their lives already. But it all felt worth it when he saw it in the distance. The gates of heaven. This civilization in the clouds. He could easily recognize man-made structures. He didn't get close to the gate, merely observing it from the distance. Single quote. This could be a strategic position to conquer. I need to quickly inform Kaido of this. And so, King quickly called his captain, telling him of his findings. An island 7 kilometers into the sky. Kaido asked as he drank from a barrel of sake. Indeed, I've not ventured too far into it yet, but I can see things clearly from a distance by flying up a bit more. King said as he flapped his wings and stared at the islands in the distance. In that case, you should take it, we can make it a temporary base, should be pretty well hidden. Queen is nearby, right? Queen should be on the seas below. King said as he landed back on his ship, his eyes narrowing at the seemingly peaceful sea of clouds he was on. Then go fetch him. The two of you should be more than enough to take on anything. I'd just order you to do it alone. But there's a chance that you'd run into the Sky King there. Kaido said as he took another sip from his barrel. Quote. I guess it's better to be safe. I will join up with Queen and we'll make sure to secure these Sky Islands as our territory. King then hung up and started flying again. It shouldn't take me long, it seems that Queen has been following me for a while now. But on the lower seas, he probably noticed something strange and decided to track me by my vivre card. And just like that, the tables were set for a war to be fought on two fronts. Chapter 116. First Skirmish. Blank. Pav narration _ blank. The first battle to start was on Enel's side. I need to cut down on their numbers so that I can concentrate on the people that are actually dangerous. The first thought that went through Enel's mind was to use Conqueror's Haki to get rid of the government agents, as very few of them seemed to be powerful enough to withstand it. Single quote. But Sengoku would be expecting me to start like that, so he should be ready to clash with me. I don't think I'd win a clash, but even if I did, it would just be wasted energy. In the end, Enel decided that using his devil fruit would give him better chances when it came to getting rid of as much cannon fodder as possible. And so, he smirked and brought his hand down. Mamoragan. Heavy thunder. The fight started with a bang, as Enel's words rang out at the same time as the clouds started moving. The black clouds that covered the sky roared in anger, and countless lightning bolts rang down onto the ships. The lightning swiftly targeted all of the pacifistas and government agents, but the navy was prepared. Yasukani no Magatama. Kizaru reacted the fastest, hundreds of light beams meeting head-on with the heavy thunder as their clashes filled the dark skies with explosions. Enel smiled a bit, he had started his attack a second earlier than Kizaru, so he had already taken down around 100 government agents and just as many pacifistas. The frozen sea that Aokiji had created was littered with holes now, cracking even more as Aokiji rushed to freeze it all over again. Now, Enel was satisfied with the results of that first clash, but it was far from good enough. There were still hundreds of agents and pacifistas left. The problem was that he wouldn't be able to replicate that attack for a few minutes, as the clouds were blown away by the explosions. Such a grand occasion. To have the best of the navy gathered here. Enel smiled as he paid no mind to the agents and pacifistas. Akainu simply grunted. Don't think you'll be able to weasel your way out of this one. You may be able to flee at any moment, but would you leave your allies behind like that? HMPH, I wouldn't be surprised, considering your track record. Sengoku said as some veins appeared on his forehead. I guess they're pretty serious about this. Either that or he's simply putting up a show for the world government. Enel sighed as he realized that his friendship with the Navy wouldn't allow him to get a free pass for the Revolutionary Army in that situation. At Nobleman at. Akainu probably hopes to be able to restore the influence that the Navy had previously with this war. Unfortunately, I can't allow the world government to win. I understand that fleeing isn't really an option in my case. Enel said as he blinked a few times, then a large smile rose to his lips. But do you think all of you will be able to defeat me? Enel smiled as the black clouds covered the skies once more. Sengoku looked up, raising an eyebrow as he had seen Kizaru's explosions blow them away already. Don't get cocky, you brat. Sengoku shouted as he jumped forward in front of the other Marines and grew in size. He quickly turned into a golden giant, his palm pointed to the sky as he released a massive shockwave and broke apart a large section of the clouds. Enel simply scoffed and discharged all the clouds at the same time. Kumo no Hoden. Cloud discharge. Enel had long since started creating more and more moves using his powers. It wasn't that difficult, as his fruit granted him an insane amount of diversity and possibilities. And just like that, all of the clouds around them started releasing powerful lightning bolts onto the crowd of pacifistas and CP agents. Many of the pacifists were hit, fried or melted alive by the heat. Though it was a stretch to call them alive, the agents weren't doing any better, falling by the dozens in the few seconds that the attack lasted. The attack ended quickly though, as the clouds calmed down rather quickly. Cloud discharge was an extremely quick and powerful attack, it was basically a much quicker and concentrated version of Mamoragan. But it could only take people by surprise once. Aramaki acted quickly, forming a massive dome of living wood, a massive construct sprouting from his palms that was large enough to cover them all, providing everyone with a huge roof to shield them against any future attacks from the skies. The dome did prevent Sengoku from further blowing away the clouds, but now they were somewhat protected. Well, the Marines were still rather safe, the lightning had somewhat avoided them all up to that point. Sengoku, as well as a few others, realized that Enel was likely not that willing to harm them. Single quote. As much as I dislike doing this, we need to take advantage of the fact that he's not attacking us. Sengoku gritted his teeth as he gave Akainu a complicated look. The current fleet admiral noticed that, sighing as he knew what they needed to do. In the few seconds they had spent looking at the roof over their heads, Enel had already prepared the clouds for another strike. Creating a whirlpool in the skies and letting more and more lightning rain down on their wooden shield. Aramaki scoffed when seeing that. A dirty criminal bearing his fangs against the world government. The newly appointed admiral muttered under his breath hatefully. I guess even an emperor only counts for this much. The wooden admiral said boldly as he smiled a bit. Enel simply raised an eyebrow at the man. I guess he thinks he's a good counter to me. But unlike Luffy, he's got no way to resist the heat of my attacks. And just like that, Enel brought his hand down once more, starting yet another Mamoragan right above the wooden dome. The dome quickly started trembling underneath those lightning blasts. It held up exactly for 2 seconds before massive lighting pillars from the skies poked holes into it with ease. Kizaru was prepared this time though, quickly sending light beam after light beam to intercept the beams. Unfortunately for him, Enel's lighting was extremely destructive, and the lightning pillars managed to overwhelm his light this time, leading to many casualties on their side. Pacifistas exploding and CP agents scrambling to dodge attacks, everything was looking like the scene from an apocalyptic movie. And that entire time Enel had yet to move from his position. Sengoku quickly rushed out of the dome and started pushing away the clouds again, the anger in his giant golden face rather easy to discern. We need to deal with Enel quickly. We won't get far by only defending. Akainu shouted as he also started running towards Enel. His arms turned into magma as he formed an obscenely large fist made completely out of melted rock. Dai Funka. Major eruption. The magma fist barreled forwards, melting the ice in front of him as it approached Enel at impressive speeds. As the giant magma fist flew towards Enel, Akainu blasted himself to the side. Enel stood there, stone-faced. He raised his arm towards it without losing any of his calm. El Thor. His palm turned into a huge lightning beam, which swallowed up the attack completely, at least for half a second. The ice underneath him shifted and covered his legs completely. Enel simply raised an eyebrow at that. Then, a yellow light flashed to his side, a large figure wearing a golden suit kicking toward him with a glowing leg. Enel merely scoffed, as he had already anticipated the attack. Kizaru's kick connected, Enel turning into lightning and letting it pass through him. One of his earlobes shot up, the golden earring turning into a spear point as it stabbed at Kizaru's head at lightning speed. Kizaru sweated a bit, his eyes widened as he managed to lean backwards, the blackened spear point breaking his sunglasses, shooting them off his head and cutting a bit into his forehead. It didn't do much damage, only a small cut, as Kizaru had managed to use armament hockey in time. But Kizaru had lost his balance as he had been kicking already. Enel's staff came barreling towards him, jabbing him in the gut and sending him flying to the side. The Lightning Emperor then tapped the ice around him with his staff, breaking it as he took off flying, dodging yet another magma fist coming from his other side in the process. Enel pointed his staff towards Akainu, its tip splitting into dozens of threads as they all turned black and rushed to impale him. Akainu stopped. Magma rose in front of him, blocking the tendrils momentarily. But the hockey-clad tendrils seemed to start piercing through the magma wall, not bothered by the temperature at all. Akainu scoffed, but he didn't get to do much, as the tendrils reaching for him all collapsed. Gravito. Fujitora walked forwards, using his power to press Enel to the ice, and bringing him down from the skies, forcing him to retrieve the tendrils and reform his staff. Enel gritted his teeth as the pressure on his back mounted, the ice 100 meters around him cracking and fragmenting. Fujitora wasn't done though. While his enemy was suppressed, he quickly sent a flying slash towards him. The pacifistas had also finally managed to lock onto Enel, and all of their mouths opened up at the same time, sending hundreds of lasers in his direction. Enel finally got used to the pressure Fujitora was putting on him, only to see the barrage of attacks coming toward him. He instantly turned into a lightning bolt, the lasers passing through his body as he took to the skies once more. The clouds around were scattered everywhere, as Sengoku had taken it upon him to make sure Enel wouldn't be able to fight at full power. Enel had a foreboding feeling, so he quickly parted his body at his head, just as a bullet rang through it. In the distance, Enel could feel Tokikake in the distance, holding a rifle pointed at him. Scoffing, he sent a lightning bolt towards him. The lightning bolt was simply intercepted by a flying slash, as Tokikake didn't even flinch, only looking at Enel with narrowed eyes. Gion swiped her sword once more, sending another flying slash at him, which he easily dodged. Both Gion and Tokikake were admiral-level figures, only slightly falling behind Fujitora and Aramaki. More and more vice admirals joined in, throwing flying sashes at the sky as Enel parted his body around them. The pacifistas were still locked onto him, sending flying lasers all across the sky and filling it with yellow explosions. Meanwhile, some government agents were trying to sneak toward Baltigo, suppressing their presence while doing so. But Enel had already felt them on his radar, there was no escaping him. He quickly flashed towards them, appearing in front of them in the blink of an eye and striking one of them with his staff and sending him into his partners, injuring 5 of them in the process. The pacifistas also had their view of him obscured, so they were unable to shoot him. His body was then forced to bend around yet another hockey-clad bullet from Tokikake. The admiral-level sniper had no issue with shooting between the small gaps among the numerous CP agents in front of Enel. Enel then twisted in the air, his staff blocking Kizaru's kick, as the light admiral had followed him, keeping up with his speed perfectly. This isn't looking all that great for me. Chapter 117. In Battle News and Forced Choices. Blank. Pav narration _ blank. Enel continued blocking kick after kick from Kizaru with his staff, sometimes bending his body with Kami-e to avoid a stray bullet from Tokikake, but otherwise undisturbed by the hundreds of pacifists still waiting to lock onto him. Quote. We need to deal with him quickly if we actually want this invasion to succeed. Akainu said as he raised his arm, signaling all of the CP agents to advance. The agents quickly also ordered the pacifistas to do the same, realizing that the Marines would likely hold back the Sky King. Enel noticed their movements though, his perception already spread out throughout the whole battlefield and his radar active at all times. The Sky King raised both of his arms in the air, shocking Kizaru as he turned his staff into a pair of white gauntlets. Kizaru took that opportunity, kicking toward Enel, only to then narrow his eyes as his hockey-clad hit harmlessly passed through Enel's torso. Kizaru kept his leg there, preparing to explode it with light. Kaminari Nagashi. Lightning current. Enel muttered as he brought his hands down rapidly, Kizaru's leg still kicking through his ephemeral torso. Then Kizaru heard Akainu's voice. Kizaru. Retreat. The fleet admiral's voice came in a bit too late. Though, Kizaru's eyes widened, as he tried to turn into light, but just as he was about to do that, Enel grabbed onto his leg, and Kizaru could feel his power slipping away. His body quickly released an ungodly amount of lightning, spreading in every direction all around him. Kizaru took the brunt of the attack. The current didn't last long though, but 2 seconds were enough to burn Kizaru's leg and fill his body with burns. The Light Admiral collapsed on the melting ice below, smoke rising from him as he passed out due to the shock. The agents that had been trying to pass by Enel fell along with him. Their states were unknown, as they were far less durable than an admiral. Aokiji quickly refroze the sea around Enel, and Tokikake managed to take that opportunity and grazed Enel's torso with one of his bullets. Ryusei Kazan. Meteoric Volcano. Shit. Akainu shouted as his countless magma fists shot at the skies. This is so annoying. I can't even go all out here, since we're in the middle of the sea. The fleet admiral thought to himself as he continued to try and suppress Enel with more and more attacks. Even when predicting Enel's trajectory, his attacks were far too slow for them to catch Enel off guard. Ice block. Pheasant flock. Aokiji quickly joined in dozens of flying large ice birds shooting up at the skies, cutting off more and more of Enel's paths. Enel scoffed, as he realized that the Marines were trying to corner him off. He didn't want to let that happen, so he tapped his hands together as he bent his body around one of Aokiji's ice birds. The ice constructs instantly turned to water as soon as they passed through Enel. The Sky King then parted his hands, forming a thick line of electricity between his gloves. The gloves quickly changed their shape, leaving his palm empty as the stream of electricity became thicker and brighter. Gravito. Enel felt the pressure upon him, much stronger this time, as Fujitora stood in front of him floating on a large piece of ice. Enel hit the bed of ice below without making any sounds, cracking it once again underneath his feet as he shot back up almost instantly. I already got used to it. Enel smiled at the bewildered blind admiral, as his attack was finally charged up enough. 60 billion volt Jambol. Thunder Dragon. A large flying Easter dragon flowed out of the powerful stream that Enel had been charging. It wiggled like a snake in the sky, its tail swatting away the incoming lasers as it coiled around Enel for a few seconds, batting away all projectiles, its body almost turning solid as the lightning concentrated more and more and formed its body. The frozen seas around them quickly started steaming up, melting rapidly as the lightning dragon exuded more and more heat. Fujitora sweated a bit as he flew above the dragon on his piece of ice. He took out his sword and slashed at it. The dragon's body seemed to part slightly at that hit, looking like its skin was cut, but it quickly reformed. This is absurd. How would one go about defeating this thing? Aokiji thought to himself as he saw the dragon burning anything it came in touch with to cinders. The dragon then roamed free, part of its tail still covering Enel. Tokikake attempted to shoot toward Enel, but the bullets seemed to melt into nothing the second they entered the dragon's tail, which was still shielding Enel. The first one to act was Sengoku this time, taking his attention away from the clouds and sending a large shockwave at the dragon with his palm. The shockwave managed to stop the dragon in its path, making Enel narrow his eyes a bit. Then Fujitora acted once more, calling down a meteor. This time though, he didn't aim for Enel. No, instead he aimed for Baltigo. Directly. Shit. If that hits the island a lot of people will die. At Nobleban at. Enel scowled as the dragon he created quickly rushed towards that meteor. The dragon coiled around in the air, stopping the meteor with its body and creating an explosion large enough to cover the sky above Baltigo. At that point, the entire island of Baltigo shook, and the seas around them as well. The ice cracked once more, causing a few of the pacifistas to sink as Aokiji quickly acted to freeze the seas once more. This time the terrain was a lot more uneven, as the shockwave of that explosion had created waves throughout the area. But uneven terrain didn't matter much, as all of the people present could use observation hockey to somewhat track Enel. The problem came with actually managing to land a hit on him. Tokikake used that opportunity of the dragon leaving Enel's side to once again start shooting at the Lightning Emperor, and Gion also got a bit closer, cleaving her sword at him with a vengeance. Enel decided to take down more of his opponents at that time. I feel bad for injuring them. But I can't afford to lose here. He appeared near Gion. At a strange angle, Tokikake in the distance tried to shoot at him, but he wasn't fast enough. Gion quickly cut at him with her blackened blade, an attack he easily let pass through him. At least he thought he did, but a second slash seemed to trail right behind it as an afterimage, leaving a bloody cut across his chest. The Lightning Emperor didn't let that dissuade him though, merely grunting a bit and complaining inwardly about how odd and unpredictable Gion's swordsmanship was. Enel moved his hands around Guion, one of his hands held above her head, the other in parallel, around 1 meter apart, somewhat near her knee, palm pointing up. Vari. Electrical discharge. Enel acted as a makeshift taser, instantly electrocuting Guion. She managed to resist for a few seconds, allowing Aokiji to freeze Enel. But she collapsed right after, smoke coming off of her body as her consciousness slipped, her mind filled with only indignation. Enel easily broke out of the ice, his body exuding enough heat to turn the ice to steam instantly. He then smiled as he felt the first few blimps depart from Baltigo. I don't have to hold them back for long now. Enel then looked over at the remaining CP agents, they were still attempting to run past him. He pointed his palm at them and released yet another series of lightning bolts, all aiming directly for them. Aokiji and Aramaki put walls of ice and wood between the agents and Enel, but they were burnt through almost instantly. Aokiji knew that he was a bad matchup for Enel, so he never bothered getting close to the Sky King, but Aramaki was a bit less wise in that aspect. He continued trying to put more walls in between Enel and the agents, unsuccessfully. But Aramaki had other plans. The wooden admiral quickly extended his arm into countless wooden tendrils and tried to grab at Enel. The young emperor simply turned into a bolt of lightning, easily escaping the wooden tendrils as they burned behind him. He then appeared in front of Aramaki, his gauntlets turning back into a staff as he swung it at the admiral's head. Aramaki quickly turned into wood completely, but he was still solid. Enel's staff seemed to pass through his neck, leaving behind a tight and extremely thin collar. The wooden admiral then felt all of his power drain. He quickly grasped at the collar around his neck desperately, but it was far too thin for him to grasp. Enel simply whacked him over the head in the split second he tried to remove his collar, sending him flying and breaking the ice around him due to the shockwave. The Lightning Emperor then appeared in front of the CP agents once more, dodging some lasers from the pacifistas remaining and some magma fists from Akainu in the process. The fact that you've been ignoring me is quite hurtful, Enel said as he pointed his palm towards them. Tish. A man wearing a white suit walked forward. Enel instantly recognized him as a higher-ranking member in the CP0. Not because he had seen him before, but because it was rather clear that the ones wearing white suits were more important. The agents behind him all prepared to fight Enel to the death. Well, at least die trying, but the high-ranking agent simply raised his hand. The agents behind him all stopped in their tracks, and Enel raised an eyebrow at that. Aokiji already took the opportunity to freeze his legs once again, but Enel didn't even react to that, as he knew it was of no consequence. The high-ranking agent looked at Enel with a shady gaze. We have just received an interesting report. The agent started speaking, much to Enel's surprise. Kaido's forces have started gathering in the skies, and a fight broke out, parting the clouds and uncovering a large island high up in the sky. Enel's eyes widened at that point, as some veins appeared on his forehead. So they discovered Skypa now. Shit. We've already come to the conclusion that the Sky Island is your hidden base. Kaido's men are likely already stripping it and turning it into their own. The agent smiled as he continued speaking, looking at Enel's reactions with a sadistic gaze. So, are you going to keep protecting this place, or are you going to save your own? You better choose soon, I doubt you have much time. Chapter 118. Trust and Lesson. Blank. Pav narration _ blank. Enel stared at the CP agent in front of him with a blank gaze. The agent noticed that, so he decided to try and hurry Enel a bit more. Do you really have the time to be standing there? He didn't get to finish the sentence though. I thought you guys were smarter than that. You already know Garp is with me. Do you really think Kaido's crew can do much there? Enel simply gave the agents a mocking smile. HMPH. Even we were able to capture him. Even if he is able to escape, he won't be able to defend the entire island from Kaido's strongest. At Nobleman at. To that, Enel simply burst out laughing. Yahahaha. Tilda. The Emperor clutched at his belly and wiped a tear off of his face. The Marines had already taken enough time to recover, and they were preparing to attack Enel once more. You guys are really looking down on us. Even if Kaido went there himself, he would still be forced to retreat. Enel flashed a sadistic smile. Garp isn't alone on that island. Francisco can likely intimidate Kaido away just by being there. And if it's really just Kaido's subordinates attacking, well, they aren't much really. And so, Enel turned his staff into a long spear, piercing it right through the agent's head. The high-ranking agent only got to bring his hands up, trying to block the spear point as his palms turned black, but the spear point parted around his hands and pierced through his head directly. Enel then killed off a few more of the agents in front of him before being stopped by a large shockwave and a wave of magma, both Akainu and Sengoku acting at the same time. Gravito. Fujitora also acted quickly, suppressing Enel once again as he flew on his block of ice. Both attacks threatened to crush his body from both sides. Enel simply pointed both of his hands on each side, and released a huge laser from both of them. Akainu's attack was quickly overwhelmed, but the shockwave of Sengoku's palm managed to send Enel flying. The Lightning Emperor quickly regained his stability in the air, breathing out as he continued to dodge attacks from all sides. I don't know how much more I'll be able to keep this up, but I still have the stamina for now. I wonder how the situation is up there on Skypa. The world government now knows its location, which can't be a good thing. Regardless of that, I trust Garp and Francisco to handle things there. And so, the Lightning Emperor continued fighting. Rewinding time a bit, just before Enel started his fight with the Marines, King had managed to reunite with Queen. It wasn't hard, and it didn't take long. King even managed to carry their entire ship to the Sea of Clouds, grabbing its mast with his talons. And using his monstrous strength to pull it along. The ship was from the treasure tree atom, so it held up quite well even when carried like that. Piercing the Sea of Clouds wasn't all that hard for him, all it took was a sword slash and he was able to pass through without any issue. And so, King and Queen prepared to take over the Sky Islands at the behest of their captain. They weren't the only people in on that operation though. Each had a Tobarapo tagging along. This was so that they would be able to face anything they would come across. King had Who's Who accompanying him, a 3.3-meter slim and tall man with long pink hair and a pair of horns on his head. Who's Who wore an unbuttoned leather jacket, leather pants and shoes. All red, as it seemed to be his favorite color. He also wore a mask only on the top half of his face, also red. A katana with a pink sheath was on his waist. And Queen had Sasaki, also extremely tall, standing at 3.2 meters, but he was extremely fat and strangely proportioned. He had long green hair, a pair of horns, and two long canines jutting out of his mouth even when he kept it close. He wore a white coat, draping it over his shoulders, black pants and boots. On his belt was a large sword with a strange design. Both of them were competing for the currently free spot in the All-Stars, the highest rank of the Beast Pirates. They had adequate strength, and they were both rather excited at the prospect of capturing the Sky Island. The first place that fell to them was Heaven's Gate. Who's Who ended up killing the old lady that greeted them without any hesitation. King didn't really care to stop him, and neither did anybody else. The Beast Pirates all believed in strength, and not one of them really cared for the safety of regular civilians. The old lady had barely gotten the time to contact Gonfall just before her death, leading to the old god of Skypa to hear her death over the transponder snail. Who's Who simply shook the blood off his blade and picked up the transponder snail and started speaking. Greetings. Whoever is on the other side of this line, know that the Sky Islands are to be ruled by the Beast Pirates from now on. We will advance further into the islands, know that you will die if you try to resist. Then, the Tobarapo simply crushed the transponder snail in his palm. That's certainly one way to announce our arrival, Queen said as he looked over at Who's Who with narrowed eyes. Some casualties are necessary if we want to instill fear into them quickly. King simply shrugged, and the ships continued sailing forward, onwards to the islands in the sky. And while they did that, Gonfall quickly contacted everyone that he could. Garp and Francisco were both shocked when they were disturbed from their training sessions. The students were happy to get a small break at least. Gonfall quickly briefed them on the situation. Garp wasn't bothered all that much, and Francisco simply frowned when hearing that they had killed an old lady randomly. Did you already call Enel? Garp asked as he rubbed his chin a bit. He was confident in taking on just about anyone. But he was unsure if he could win against Kaido and his crew all by himself. He also didn't really want to put his trust in Francisco, who was formerly in the same crew as Kaido. He didn't pick up. I don't know what is happening on his side. Gonfall said as he rubbed his eyebrows in frustration. Bah, he's probably sleeping. Shoved that staff of his so far up his ass that he can no longer hear us. Garp scoffed a bit, crossing his arms and looking to the side, looking at Francisco for a bit. The two of them had broken out of prison together. Garp was okay with him back then, because he felt that Francisco had already given up on a life of piracy. But after getting accepted by Enel, Francisco started training his body once more, bringing it into decent shape quite quickly with a rigorous diet and exercise routine. At that point, it was clear to Garp that, even after all those decades of torture, the pirate inside Francisco was still alive and well. This led to Garp not really trusting the old man, as he remembered just how much trouble he and Rox had given him in the past. But at that point, with a war knocking on his door, he needed all the help possible. He needed to make sure that no harm came to the people on Sky Island, and especially to the people of Fuchsia Village, who were being hunted down because of him. And he couldn't do that alone. I guess I've no choice but to trust my back to him now. We'll have to gather everyone and prepare for this. Francisco rubbed his chin as he sat down on the couch. I don't think they will react nicely to this. Have some of them at least manage to get stronger during your training. Gonfal said, his voice hopeful. Maybe the old men in front of him weren't their only fighters on the island. They had plenty of soldiers, but Enel had already told him of how dangerous the Grand Line was. Some of them are decent enough already. They'll mostly be dealing with grunts, but even regular soldiers will be zone devil fruit users. So this might be even harder than anticipated. Garp's words made Francisco raise an eyebrow. So many devil fruits. Has something happened while I was imprisoned? Did they suddenly start growing on trees or something? Quote. Did you miss the part where Enel told us about Kaido's army and the smile fruits? He didn't go in much detail. Basically their fruits aren't real. Gonfal said as he raised an eyebrow at Francisco. Oh, I wasn't paying attention to that part of the meeting. Francisco yawned a bit when speaking, not even bothering to suppress it in any way. Senile bastard. Garp muttered under his breath, looking to the side again and grumbling a bit. Francisco just gave him a sideways glance. You're one to talk. After that, Francisco slowly got up from the couch. Still, to think they'd just kill a helpless old lady. It seems these barbarians have no respect for the elderly. Francisco said as he grasped the hilt of his cutlass, his lips curling up a bit. Garp seemed to get in the same mood as him, also extremely mad that the Fuchsia villagers were going to be bothered so soon after settling in. Indeed. I guess it's up to us old men to teach them some manners, huh? Garp cracked his knuckles, as a forced smile also rose to his lips. Chapter 119. Moods, Marksman and War. Blank. Pav narration underscore, blank. And so, every recruit was ushered near the shore of the island, including Bonnie, Bellamy and Wiper. All of them were armed and ready, as two old men walked out in front of everybody. At Nobleman at. Garp and Francisco both had smiles on their faces, brimming with confidence and prepared to face off against anything the world had to throw at them. Will I be able to meet that brat, Kaido again so soon? Francisco was even excited at the possibility of reuniting with one of his old crewmates. As some of you might already know, pirates are attacking the island. And unlike the last times this happened, these pirates are extremely powerful. Bellamy frowned a bit and complained under his breath when hearing that. Wiper, the one that had defeated him, looked at him with a cheeky smile. Bonnie was simply munching on some lamb chops, not really interested in the situation. She simply glanced at the two legends that were currently giving them a briefing on the pirates that were attacking the island. She was shocked to hear that it was the beast pirates of all people that decided to attack the island. But she wasn't scared in any way. Push come to shove, I can always do that. There's little in this world that these two can't take on together. Remember, the beast pirates are cruel, they only care about power. And like most pirates, they won't hesitate to kill you either. Garp's voice rang out like thunder, as all of the civilians that had also gathered started hiding in their homes. Sir Garp. We can see their ships approaching. One Shandian warrior flew in on a pair of shooters, air-dreading roller blades basically, and gave Garp and Francisco more information on their enemy's position. Indeed. They're almost here already, Francisco said as he turned his back to the crowd and sighed a bit. I guess that Dragon Brat isn't with them. Don't know if this complicates things or not. The legendary old pirate spoke with a bit of sadness in his voice. Hey, you and your abnormal observation range. That was always annoying to deal with, good thing you were never good with aiming for long distances. Garp said as he also turned around. Not good. I beg your pardon, you old dog. Francisco rolled up his sleeve, revealing the metallic gauntlet on his arm as he took out his cutlass, a regular-looking blade, but upon closer inspection was also extremely blunt. It was the blade Francisco used in training, and it seemed he was peppered to use it right away. Easy now, old ladies. Stop bickering and don't start fighting each other for no reason. Bonnie said with a sneer. But she still noticed that the antics of the two old men managed to relax some of the island soldiers, which was an extremely good thing. Shut it, you old hag. Garp shouted, crossing his arms and huffing a bit, causing some veins to appear on Bonnie's forehead. She was about to start yet another shouting match with the irritating person that Enel had left her with, but Francisco interrupted her. I don't direct my blade towards allies. I shall prove my superior marksmanship this very moment. The old pirate gripped the blunt cutlass tighter, assisted by the mechanical glove he was wearing. Bah. Good luck. Also, don't call this shit marksmanship, you ain't even using a proper weapon. Garp said as he took out a packet of rice crackers and sat down on the sand. By now, the two gigantic pirate ships could be seen in the distance. Small dots, barely noticeable, they were sailing side by side, going at the exact same speed. Francisco simply scoffed, bringing his blunt cutlass above his head, while putting his other arm in front, seemingly aiming for a few seconds. I bet you'll miss by a few nautical miles. Also, why are you pretending to aim with your eyes? You don't have any. Garp said as he huffed a bit. Shut it. A master marksman is concentrating. Francisco silenced him, his blade pointing at the sky still. Quote. Garp was about to comment about Francisco using a sword and calling himself a marksman, but he didn't get to, as Francisco finally brought his arm down. With a heave, a powerful and gigantic flying slash rushed forwards. The mere shockwave of that sword strike shook the trees nearby and made most of the students present take a step back. The flying slash parted the sea of clouds, creating a gorge so long that it spanned over 10 kilometers. The ships seemed to be blasted to a side, forced to part with one another as the flying slash went right between them, almost flipping them over in the process. The seas rumbled and the skies cried, as Francisco's slash only stopped after passing by the two ships. Bwahahaha. You fucking missed. Great marksman my ass. Garp immediately started laughing and mocking Francisco relentlessly. Bah. I didn't miss anything. I was merely intimidating them. Francisco simply crossed his arms, sheathing his cutlass with his head held up high. Behind the two old men, not one person dared to say anything even close to mocking. The sea of clouds was still slowly reforming in front of them, trying to heal from Francisco's powerful attack. The clouds were pushed to the side all around them. It was a miracle that they weren't sent flying backwards by the shockwave, but that was just their training showing its usefulness. To think he was that strong. Both Bellamy and Wiper had their backs filled with cold sweat. As expected of a legendary pirate, I guess. Bonnie was less impressed. She could tell the old man hadn't even gone seriously on that slash. Garp, behind all the mocking and joking, was also looking at Francisco with a skeptical gaze. To think he recovered this much strength. Still, compared to back then. Garp looked at the recovering sea of clouds, and then at the boat swaying in the distance before sighting and getting up, leaving his rice crackers on the sand. Someone of his caliber in the past would have easily been able to slash those ships out of the sky with the flick of a wrist. It's either he's really degraded a lot, or he's not bothering to do so for some reason. Francisco must have noticed his skepticism, as he gave him a side glance and spoke in a voice only he could hear. I could have slashed them off the sea of clouds, but I think it's high time for some real-life practice for our recruits. Garp just responded with an understanding gaze, remembering that he had trained his recruits on the field a lot. Hunting pirates actively was a great exercise for quick growth. Still, to fight a Yonko crew for training. Quite unheard of. Garp said, cracking his knuckles once more. If this is truly the extent of the power that a Yonko crew can muster, then I must say that I am highly disappointed in this generation. Francisco scoffed as he remembered just what it meant to be called the strongest crew on the seas back in his day. He had heard about how the powers in the world had split in his absence. He even had enough knowledge to identify one of the attackers. That flying dinosaur floating ahead of the ships is likely King, Kaido's right-hand man. The mere thought of that filled Francisco with disappointment. This is considered the vice captain of one of the strongest crews. Sufficient to say that he was quite pissed as well. I expected better from that little dragon. The powers in the world, as well as the balance itself, really shifted after the Rocks pirates fell. Back in the day, you were the leading powers on the high seas, but nowadays no one crew can possibly reach that strength. Garp patted the sand off his ass as he looked at the approaching ships. Francisco simply grunted. He understood that was the case, but he still found it disappointing. If things keep going like this, no one will really ever be able to stand against the world government. At the very least Enel has high enough chances right now. Me and this old guy here will take care of the strongest ones. You all deal with the dregs. Garp shouted, gaining everyone's attention as they all prepared to engage the enemy. Francisco sighed, shaking his thoughts away and directing his attention at the war that was starting right in front of him. The beast pirates weren't having a nice time though. At first, they figured they'd have an easy time taking over the island. Just a few barbarians that didn't know much about the outside world, nothing unseen before. But then the flying slash threatened to kill them all in one swift strike. The ones able to fly managed to dodge away in fear. King dodged calmly, but even he realized that their conquest wasn't going to be that easy. Who's Who and Sasaki refused to flinch, but they both felt a bit of fear when seeing how close both of their ships were to falling to the seas below. Queen didn't care much, confident in his defense and power to block a slash like that if the need arose. It's pretty clear that our enemy wants us to get closer, Queen thought to himself as he saw the sea reforming. King had also realized that, if the person that released that slash wanted to, he could have sunk both of their ships easily. I don't like this, but we can't exactly afford to fail here or disrespect Kaido's direct orders. And so, the ships finally came close to shore, hundreds of pirates pouring out. King was the first to land on shore, coming face to face with Garp and Francisco. Behind them were a few hundred soldiers, prepared to defend their homeland. King sweated a bit when he recognized Garp, the worst situation materializing in front of him. I and Queen should be able to take him on. But, who's the blind old man standing by his side? King narrowed his eyes when seeing that the blind old man was holding a cutlass. Single quote. It can't be. You're telling me that panic amongst our troops was caused by an old cripple. Quote. We have come here with direct orders for Lord Kaido. You can either surrender or suffer the consequences. King decided to continue with the war. Who's Who and Sasaki should be able to take on that old guy. Or at least hold him back while we deal with Garp. Consequences. You think you've got the right to stroll in here and talk about consequences? Garp immediately dashed at King, starting the fight with a bang. King was forced to fly backwards, dodging Garp's renowned fist by a few centimeters as the shockwave sent him flying further. Beast pirates. Attack. King's voice rang out, as he took out his sword, flames rising up all around him as he started engaging Garp by himself for a while. Queen quickly joined him, jumping into the fray just in time to receive one of Garp's patented fists of love, loveless this time though, so Queen was sent flying back onto his ship, destroying the deck entirely. Sky Warriors. Kill these cretins. Francisco quickly shouted as he sent a flying slash and cut towards one of the pirate ships. Who's Who and Sasaki immediately roared and acted, realizing that the blind old man was likely the obstacle that the two of them needed to deal with. Sasaki turned into a dinosaur and rushed to impale him on his large horn, while Who's Who rushed to the front of his ship and took out his blade, trying to block the old man's flying slash. Sasaki's attack was dodged with ease, the old man stepping on his horn and kicking off his head towards Who's Who was still struggling against the previous flying slash. Who's Who's eyes widened when he saw the old man appear near him, blunt cutlass raised towards him. He was forced to use Soru and disappear from there, leading to his ship being cut in half. Shit. The pirates quickly started, heading for land, where they were faced with the Sky Warriors. Spring Death Knock. Bellamy struck the head of an insect-like enemy, making him skid backwards a bit. The beast pirate seemed otherwise uninjured, merely smiling and mocking Bellamy with his gaze. These people are weaklings. Kill them all. The pirate shouted, and just as he did, his head was cut off instantly by a flying blade. Hold them here. Not one of them is touching our people. Wiper, who had sent that Rankyaku, shouted to the rest of his men. And so, the war waged on. Chapter 120. Fledgling and True Conquerors. Blank. Pav narration _ blank. The fight raged on, with the Shandian warriors and sky guards somehow holding on. Bellamy was hopping around the battlefield everywhere, distracting enemies and helping wherever he could. He, like many others, could barely do any damage to the beast pirates. Wiper and a few others could actually fight properly, but all of them could at least dodge around and block the beast pirates. Bonnie also was quite crucial for the Sky People's defense, as she simply strolled around the battlefield and finished all the pirates she could with a single touch, turning them either into babies or old men at random. In the end, the fight turned out to be a stalemate on their end, as some of the stronger beast pirates had hockey, and could hold off Bonnie. Meanwhile, Wiper had yet to learn armament, so he was struggling against those that knew hockey as well. Thankfully, Bellamy was doing a good job of distracting the beast pirates with his odd movements, but he still couldn't do much damage, and a single stray hit would have been enough to take him out. Wiper fought and fought hard at that. But he felt ashamed when seeing how weak he was, especially so when he encountered an odd bear-human hybrid with armament hockey. Enel would have been able to kill them all instantly. And here I am struggling against a random and useless piece of shit. He was angry. He felt as if he was being left far behind. No, he had been left behind for a long time. Since the beginning, Enel was much stronger than he was, but he still had hopes that he would be able to catch up one day. The bear-human hybrid swiped its claws at Wiper, laughing all along as Wiper stepped backwards and shoved his burn bazooka down its throat. Shut up and burn. Without hesitating at all, he pulled the trigger, his bazooka releasing a gout of powerful flame right inside his enemy's mouth. The bear-human hybrid reeled back, grasping at its neck and face as they burnt up badly. Wiper looked around him, seeing more and more of his people get injured by pirates. Slowly but surely, he became angrier and angrier. Was I always this fucking powerless? In his mind, he kept telling himself that, had Enel been there, the situation would have already been over. Wiper dashed in, taking on more and more enemies, as wounds accumulated on his body. Bellamy was inspired by his struggle, so he quickly jumped in as well, not caring for the accumulating cuts and bruises on his body as he bounced around the battlefield as fast as he could. Eventually, Wiper's body had had enough. The pirates were circling around him and the remaining Sky Warriors. It was unknown how many of their people had died, and how many were injured. But one thing was clear. This isn't fair, Bellamy said as he clutched at his broken arm. His springy step was stopped as his bones ached and a sharp pain shot up all across his body. Wiper looked at him for a few seconds. Bellamy had only joined them all recently, so it was to be expected that he was among the weaker present. Yet he had held up quite well throughout the whole thing, refusing to let up all that time. It seems this is our end. Huh. More of the people behind him started lamenting, as the pirates seemed to rejoice in their fear and despair. Garp and Francisco both seemed too busy with their respective fights to assist them. Garp specifically was forced to dodge constant lasers from Queen, while sparring with King, batting away sword strikes and talon slashes. King used his whole body in the fight, refusing to give Garp even a moment of rest. Francisco was in a similar situation, Sasaki trying to hold him down while who fought him with either finger guns or flying slashes. Wiper realized that they wouldn't be getting any help from them. Even worse, he found it pathetic that he even expected their help in the first place. If they aren't able to help us, then we must help ourselves. It was a strange feeling, from the depths of his soul. It was as if his fate had shifted completely. Beyond anyone's expectations, a wave of conquerors' hockey washed over the entire battlefield, making everyone turn their heads toward the scene. Including Garp and Francisco, as well as their opponents. Francisco simply smiled at the scene, as he felt Wiper's aura through his observation. He's gotten much stronger. Finally a fitting student. Wiper, on the verge of passing out, glared at his enemies with bloodshot eyes. You think you're tough shit? Come and get me then. He spat out those words with pure vitriol, unleashing his will upon the beast pirates. All of them took a step back, but it was far too weak to knock them out. And just as Wiper finished his words, the cannon in his grasp hit the floor. He was unconscious. But he didn't fall to the ground himself. No, he stood tall as his eyes glazed over. The Sky people were inspired by the scene, but they were all too tired to move at that point. The beast pirates simply seemed to be looking warily at the unconscious Wiper before all stepping to approach the group again. This exceeded my expectations. But I guess willpower grows the quickest in stressful environments. This has been good training. Francisco nodded his head once, his smile shining. He felt the beast pirates getting closer to Wiper. Sasaki and who also both dashed towards him, hoping to take advantage of the fact that he didn't seem to be paying attention. No, can't have that. It was at that time that every pirate on the battlefield froze, including the All-Stars. Sasaki and who both stared on with wide eyes, paralyzed by their instincts. A crushing aura surged out from the blind old man that they had been fighting. It was a regal, almost baleful sensation that managed to make their spines tremble in fear. Waves of red aura seemed to buzz around in the air, each more powerful than the last. Francisco's figure became impossible to see as the red aura rolled off of him, creating sparks in the air and making red lighting appear all around him. The aura went on to encapsulate a good chunk of the sea of clouds and the entire shore of Skypa. The regular beast pirates seemed to collapse, foam coming from their mouths. The Sky people seemed to pass out as well, forming a pile of unconscious people, with eyes rolled backwards. Wouldn't want my newly discovered gifted student to keel over dead, you see. The pressure lessened a bit, as the old blind man smiled at the four pirates that were still standing. Garp simply scowled. This old fuck. Better have a talk with him later. Both Sasaki and Who seemed to take a few steps back in fear as soon as they regained control over their bodies, their legs shaking uncontrollably. King looked at the situation with horror, his back full of cold sweat. Have I ever felt Conqueror's hockey this intense? Is he on par with Kaido? No, this was a lot stronger. Garp scoffed when seeing that King, his opponent, wasn't paying attention to him. With an exhale, he delivered a powerful uppercut to the right hand of the beast pirates, sending him flying upwards, with his mask broken and face bones shattered. Ignore me more, will ya? Garp shouted in indignation as he raised his fist and punched into one of Queen's lasers. The shockwave of his fist parted the laser and seemed to crush Queen underneath it, the boat he was using as a foothold cracking more and more. The fight on their side continued, so Francisco also decided to return his attention to his supposed adversaries in that war. At Nobleman at. What's wrong? Francisco turned his head towards Sasaki and Who, both trembling slightly as the old man's attention turned to them. Please don't tell me you were intimidated by that much. Francisco scoffed at them, the corners of his mouth turning downwards in a scowl as he raised his head up high. Bah, who am I kidding? You lot have been a disappointment since you appeared on the horizon. I shouldn't have expected more of you. The beast pirates wanted to retort, but they found it difficult to refute the old man's words. I guess I should stop playing around now. Francisco simply shook his head when seeing how tensed up his enemies were. The next second, he appeared in front of Sasaki, his blunt cutlass covered in concentrated armament hockey, shining red as lighting rolled off of it. The Tobarapo quickly tried to block Francisco's blade with his own, turning his back in hopes of holding up long enough to dodge. But it didn't work. His mechanical blade was severed instantly and soon followed his half-transformed head, both of them flying off in the same second. Francisco merely sighed while shaking his head. What a shoddy display. I've cut bread with stronger willpower than this. Sasaki's head didn't even hit the ground properly, as Who decided to act. He did what was sensible in that situation, he instantly turned around and started kicking off the air as he tried to fly further and further from the shore of the island. What the hell is this thing? How the hell are we supposed to fight it? Queen noticed his retreat almost instantly. Who? You fucking coward. Kaido won't forget this. Queen's voice rang out, his rage palpable at his deserting former comrade. Fuck Kaido. I want to live. Who continued to run away, not looking back for even 1 second. So disgraceful, Francisco said as he turned the tip of his blade towards Who in the distance. With a single motion, he ran 2 fingers across his blade, bringing the hilt back, as if drawing a bow. Hockey once again covered that blunt cutlass, turning it completely black, then red, as lighting once again seemed to roll around it. Piercing blade. Autumn fang. And with a forwards thrust, the tip of Francisco's blade seemed to release a different type of flying slash. Who didn't even get to look back when he felt danger approaching. He tried to shift his body, but he didn't manage to do so in time. He only managed to move for 1 centimeter, so he covered his body in the thickest layer of armament hockey he could muster, turning it completely black. The next thing he knew, half of his torso was missing. Who was in shock, his body going limp as his eyes seemed to become blank. Francisco simply whistled a bit, as the former Tobarapo's body limply fell into the sea of clouds, like a falling leaf in autumn. The high sea is no place for weaklings. Francisco said as he looked over at Garp's fight, which was also close to wrapping up. I wonder where Enel is. Francisco thought to himself as he watched Garp punch King into the
ground. Queen shot laser after laser, hoping to somehow turn the situation around, but he realized that all was lost when King finally passed out, succumbing to his injuries. He trembled a bit when Garp turned his head towards him. You know, you've been really annoying this whole time. Garp started walking towards him, cracking his knuckles. Francisco simply sighed at that, letting Garp continue the fight, torture with Queen. He didn't waste any time though, quickly calling the rest of the Sky residents to come and help carry the injured and tie up the pirates. And so, one of the wars ended abruptly. As the might of the beast pirates proved to be far from enough to take on Enel's associates.